The stagecoach rolls into the muddy main street. Victoria peers out the window, nervous and observant, noting saloon, church, sheriff's office, curious stares. The stagecoach stops, dust and silence as townsfolk gather. John Mercer waits, tall and stern, with Ruth at his side. The coach lurched as it rattled over a rut, jolting Victoria against the worn leather seat. She clutched her reticule tighter in her lap, knuckles pale against the faded green silk of her gloves. Outside the window stretched a horizon of endless brown prairie, harsh sun flattening the land into a shimmer. Then, at last, she saw it, the cluster of buildings that was to be her new home. The town looked half-finished, as though carpenters had abandoned it mid-thought. A line of clapboard storefronts faced a street churned into muck by horses and wagons. The church steeple leaned slightly, as if tired of holding itself upright. Beside it stood a saloon with doors swinging, piano music faint in the afternoon heat. A jailhouse squatted near the end of the street, its sign freshly painted in bold black letters, Sheriff. The driver cracked his whip, and the stagecoach rattled into town. Dust rose in clouds behind them, drifting over the shop fronts and settling on the boots of men who had already stopped what they were doing to stare. Women in calico dresses shaded their eyes. A boy perched on a fence rail pointed and shouted something to his friend, laughter chasing his words. Victoria felt the weight of their gazes. Curious, assessing, suspicious. She forced her face into a calm mask, though inside her chest the rhythm of her heartbeat stumbled. The coach groaned to a halt before the general store. Silence fell heavier than the dust. For a moment no one moved. Then a figure detached itself from the gathering, broad-shouldered, straight-backed, wearing a star on his vest. The sheriff, John Mercer. He did not smile. Beside him stood a girl, 12, perhaps 13, with hair in loose braids and eyes narrowed like a cat's. The girl's arms were crossed, her chin tilted in a stance of open defiance. The driver swung down, opened the door, and held out a hand. Victoria drew in a breath, smoothed her skirts, and gathered what little courage remained. She pressed her boot to the iron step, and as she descended into the grit and heat of the street, the murmur of the crowd swelled. Every eye was upon her, and standing at the center of it all was the man she was meant to call husband. The sheriff removed his hat as she approached, though the motion carried no warmth, only duty. "Mrs. Hale," he said, voice steady, pitched low so it carried just enough. "Victoria, is it?" "Yes," she answered, her own voice softer than she intended. She corrected herself with a firmer tone. "Victoria Hale, and you must be Sheriff Mercer." His eyes were the color of storm clouds, sharp beneath the brim of his hat. He gave a brief nod. "John'll do." The girl at his side made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a snort. "This here's my daughter, Ruth," John added. Ruth didn't bother with a curtsy or even a smile. She gave Victoria a long, slow look from bonnet to boots, and then leaned toward her father with no attempt to lower her voice. "She's awful small. Mama was taller." A ripple of chuckles stirred the crowd. Victoria's cheeks warmed, but she bent toward the girl with measured calm. "Well, sometimes small things can surprise you." Ruth only blinked at her, unimpressed. A man with whiskers down to his chest muttered, "Boston bride," and another whispered back, "Looks too fine for our mud." The murmurs rolled like a tide, fragments reaching Victoria's ears. "City woman, won't last a winter, Mercer's gone soft." John glanced at the onlookers, then back at Victoria. His jaw tightened, as if he'd expected this. Without ceremony, he offered his arm. "Best get you home," he said. She placed her gloved hand lightly upon his sleeve, the gesture formal, stiff. The sheriff gave no sign of notice, guiding her forward through the circle of watchful eyes. Behind them, Ruth trailed, whispering to herself just loud enough for Victoria to catch a piece of it. "She won't last 2 weeks." The walk down Main Street felt like a slow parade, though Victoria would have preferred invisibility. Every storefront had produced spectators, shopkeepers with folded arms, women with baskets, rough men from the saloon leaning in the doorway with smirks. John kept his pace steady, hat low, one hand resting on his belt near the star pinned to his vest. Ruth darted ahead and behind like a stray cat, never quiet for long. "Pa, she's walking too slow," Ruth muttered, "like she's scared of mud." Victoria's boots sank with a soft squelch. Mud clung to the hem of her skirt. She ignored the sting in the girl's voice. From the boardwalk, a tall man with silver hair and a book tucked under his arm raised a hand. His coat was black, his collar white. Sheriff Mercer. His gaze flicked to Victoria. And this must be your bride. John slowed, tipping his hat. Reverend Cartwright. The preacher's smile was thin, as though measured for economy. Welcome, Mrs. Mercer, he said, though the name seemed to stick in his throat as if he tested how it sounded. We are blessed you've joined our flock. Victoria inclined her head. Thank you, Reverend. His eyes lingered, searching, before he moved aside with a grave nod. They passed on. The murmur of townsfolk followed like bees. Ahead, a man in a bright checked vest hopped down from a barrel, waving a small bottle as though it were a trophy. His hair was slick with oil, his grin too wide. Ezekiel Pike, ma'am, purveyor of Pike's all-healing elixir, known to cure coughs, chills, and the blackest of humors. And might I say, his gaze traveled boldly over her dress, you're a sight for sore Dakota eyes. Ruth wrinkled her nose. She don't want your swamp water, Zeke. The crowd chuckled. Ezekiel, unfazed, pressed the bottle toward Victoria. The liquid inside was the color of river mud. A welcome gift. One sip and you'll swear you never left Boston. Victoria smiled thinly, declining with a polite shake of her head. I should hate to rob you of your finest stock so soon. John's voice cut in, flat as a hammer. That's enough, Pike? Ezekiel stepped back with a bow, his grin still flashing as they passed. Victoria's grip tightened on John's arm, though she tried to disguise it. His sleeve was firm beneath her hand, unyielding as the rest of him. Every step toward the sheriff's house seemed longer than the last. The sheriff's house stood on a rise at the edge of town, a square, two-story built from weathered pine. The yard was bare dirt, a few stubborn weeds clinging at the edges. No garden, no flowers, no sign of a woman's hand, only utility. John opened the door and motioned her inside first. The air was cool and smelled faintly of smoke and leather. A single rug softened the floorboards. On the mantel above the hearth rested a photograph in a dark wooden frame, a young woman with Ruth's eyes, her expression soft and steady. Victoria's gaze lingered before she caught herself and looked away. The furniture was sturdy, worn smooth by years. Everything had its place, too neat for comfort. The silence in the house pressed close, broken only by Ruth's voice from behind. She's gonna trip in those shoes, Ruth said, tugging off her bonnet and tossing it onto a chair. Ain't no one wears kid leather here. Victoria looked down at her polished boots, dulled now by the walk through mud. They'll serve for now, she replied calmly, though the girl's sharpness cut deeper than she let show. John set his hat on a peg, then turned toward her, hands resting at his hips. His posture was not unkind, but it carried the weight of instruction. You'll find your room upstairs, he said. Supper's at 6. I keep the stove stocked with wood. Ruth takes the morning chores, water, eggs, kindling. You'll handle the house otherwise. The words fell like terms of a contract rather than a welcome. Victoria nodded once, careful to keep her face unreadable. Understood, Ruth muttered. She talks fancy too. John shot his daughter a look sharp enough to cut, and the girl fell quiet, for now. Victoria set her trunk down in the hallway, the weight of it tugging at her arm. Inside, wrapped in muslin and hidden beneath dresses, lay the instruments she dared not show. A scalpel, a set of forceps, a small bone saw, the remnants of a life she had sworn not to reveal. She smoothed her skirts and followed John's gesture toward the stairs, each step creaking beneath her, as though announcing her intrusion into this ordered life. The room upstairs was small, its ceiling sloped beneath the rafters, but a narrow window admitted a square of late afternoon light, a simple bed, a washstand with a chipped basin, a chest of drawers, nothing more. Victoria closed the door softly behind her. For the first time since stepping off the stage, she allowed her shoulders to sag. Her trunk sat waiting at the foot of the bed, its brass clasp dulled from travel. She knelt and drew it open. At the top lay gowns folded carefully, their silks already out of place in this rough country. Beneath, wrapped in muslin, was the weight she feared most, polished steel and leather, the tools of her real trade. She touched the bundle with gloved fingertips, the sight of it both comfort and curse. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand caught her eye, pale, tense, lips pressed thin. You are Mrs. Mercer now, she whispered under her breath, the words both vow and warning. No one must know. She slid the instruments beneath the bottom layer of dresses, burying them deep, then closed the trunk with a click. From the hallway came a faint creak of floorboards. She froze, breath caught, a pause, then the soft scuff of footsteps. Ruth. The girl lingered just beyond the door, silent but listening. Victoria straightened, smoothing her skirts, and forced her voice into calm evenness. "Is there something you need, Ruth?" No answer. Only the creak of retreating steps down the hall. She stood alone in the dim room, pulse still quickened, and knew the girl's suspicion had already begun. The table was already set when Victoria came down the narrow staircase. 3 plates, 3 cups, cutlery aligned with military neatness. A kerosene lamp cast a steady glow, its light pooling over the wooden boards. John sat at the head of the table, shoulders square, hands resting loosely at either side of his plate. Ruth slouched in her chair opposite, one knee pulled up, chin propped in her hand. Victoria hesitated at the threshold, the silence weighing heavier than the day's dust. "Sit," John said simply, gesturing toward the empty chair. She smoothed her skirts and obeyed. The food was plain, beans, bread, a slice of salt pork on each plate. John bowed his head briefly, murmured grace, and then began to eat without another word. Ruth tore bread into small, sharp pieces, glancing at Victoria between bites as though watching a stray dog sniff at the door. "You ever cooked beans before?" Ruth asked suddenly, her tone more challenge than curiosity. Victoria met her gaze with quiet steadiness. "I've eaten them. That ain't the same." Ruth smirked, stuffing the bread into her mouth. John's fork paused midway to his lips. "Manners," he said flatly. Ruth chewed noisily in response. Victoria reached for her cup, its tin rim cool against her fingers. She took a sip to steady herself. The silence returned, broken only by the scrape of forks and the faint tick of the clock on the mantel. John ate methodically, his posture upright, his attention fixed on the meal, as though conversation were optional. He seemed accustomed to silence, to order, to meals that filled the stomach but left the spirit hollow. Victoria forced herself to eat as well, though each bite lodged like a stone in her throat. Ruth leaned back in her chair, eyeing Victoria again. "Your dress looks like it cost more than our whole table." John set his fork down, his eyes cutting to his daughter. "Ruth." The girl crossed her arms, sulking under his gaze, but her glare slid back to Victoria with unspoken defiance. Victoria placed her fork carefully on the edge of her plate and gave Ruth a small, measured smile. "Perhaps it did, but dresses wear out, tables last longer." For the first time, Ruth faltered, her mouth opening as though to retort, then snapping shut again. John returned to his meal without comment, though Victoria thought she caught the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. The rest of the supper passed in uneasy quiet, the sound of knives on plates sharper than any words. When the last plates were cleared, Ruth clattered them into the basin with deliberate noise and stomped toward the back room, muttering about washing later. The slam of the door left the house hushed again. Victoria lingered near the table, uncertain of her place. Her gaze wandered across the room, drawn inevitably to the mantel. The photograph she had glimpsed earlier seemed to watch her still. A woman in a dark dress, hair coiled neatly, eyes steady. She stepped closer. Beside the photograph lay a folded quilt, carefully draped over the arm of a chair, its stitching precise, the fabric worn thin in places, but preserved as if untouched since its maker last laid it down. "You keep her things just so," Victoria said quietly, half to herself. John, who was stacking the bread into its tin, paused but didn't turn. "Some things don't need moving." Victoria let her hand hover above the quilt, resisting the urge to touch. She was very beautiful. Now he looked at her, expression unreadable. She was. The silence stretched. He returned to tidying, each movement brisk, controlled. Victoria stood where she was, caught between respect and unease. The house felt less like a home than a shrine, each object a relic of a life she had not lived, a life she was expected somehow to replace. John finally broke the quiet, his voice lower, edged. "Ruth still misses her mother. Best not to press it." "I understand," Victoria murmured. And she did, more than he knew. For a moment his eyes softened, as though some unspoken thought flickered there. Then it was gone, shuddered, and he turned back to his orderliness. Victoria folded her hands before her, the weight of the photograph and quilt heavy in her chest. She was not only a stranger in this house, she was an intruder into memory. The house settled into quiet once Ruth had been sent upstairs, her footsteps thudding along the boards overhead, before the door closed with a sharp snap. Victoria remained by the hearth, her hands folded loosely before her. John sat in the chair across the table, the lamplight cutting across his face, deepening the hollows beneath his eyes. He had the air of a man used to ending his days in silence, and it seemed almost an effort for him to shape words. "You'll find this isn't a complicated house," he said finally. His voice was even, but not unkind. "Meals, chores, keeping things straight. I don't ask for more." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "You don't strike me as a man who asks for anything at all." He studied her, unreadable. "Best not to expect much either. Folks here don't care for change." She met his gaze without flinching. "Nor do they care for strangers." A faint twitch of his mouth, close to a smile, though it didn't quite reach. "You noticed. I would have been blind not to." The silence that followed was charged, not empty. The tick of the clock, the faint hiss of the lamp, the distant bark of a dog beyond the window, all seemed to sharpen the space between them. John leaned back slightly, hands resting on his knees. "I don't intend to pry into whatever brought you west. You're here. That's enough." Her throat tightened at the generosity hidden in those words. Or was it indifference? She could not tell. "I appreciate that," she said carefully. His eyes lingered on her a moment longer, as if trying to decide whether she spoke truth. Then he rose, reaching for the lamp. "You'll want rest. Tomorrow starts early here." She inclined her head. "Good night, Sheriff." "John," he corrected, though the name sounded like a boundary rather than an invitation. The flame dimmed, plunging the room into shadows. Upstairs, the little room was cooler now, the prairie night slipping through the cracks of the window frame. Victoria lit the oil lamp on the washstand and knelt before her trunk once more. She drew out the bundle wrapped in muslin and set it gently on the bed. With care, she peeled back the cloth, revealing steel that glinted even in the dim light. A scalpel, fine forceps, a bone saw, each polished and preserved like a forbidden treasure. Her fingers hovered over them. For years, these had been her salvation, her proof of skill. Now they were contraband. She rewrapped the bundle quickly, sliding it beneath the false bottom she had constructed in her trunk. From a side pocket, she withdrew a leather-bound notebook, its pages crowded with notes in her precise hand. Sketches of anatomy, lists of treatments, observations she dared not voice aloud. She opened it to a page marked by a scrap of ribbon and read for a long moment, lips moving silently over Latin words. The act steadied her, like breathing in familiar air. A floorboard creaked. Her head snapped up, pulse leaping. The sound came from the hall, soft but distinct. A pause. Then the faintest brush of cloth against the door. Victoria closed the notebook at once, shoving it under her pillow. She blew out the lamp, plunging the room into shadow. She listened. Silence. Then, another faint creak, footsteps retreating down the hall. Ruth. Victoria sat on the edge of the bed, heart still racing, staring into the darkness. She had not yet been a wife in this house for a single night, and already suspicion stalked her steps. Lying back against the pillow, she kept her eyes open long after the house grew still. The morning began with the slam of the front door. John had left before the sun burned the mist from the prairie, his heavy steps fading into the distance, his day already claimed by the badge. Ruth shuffled down the stairs half-dressed, her braid loose, her school slate clutched under her arm. She gave Victoria the barest glance before grabbing a heel of bread from the cupboard. "Don't wait supper for me," she muttered, though Victoria doubted the girl had ever asked permission in her life. With a bang of the screen door, she was gone too, her voice already carrying into the street as she joined other children. Silence fell across the house, deeper than before. Victoria lingered in it for a moment, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and yesterday's beans, the quiet ticking of the clock. She had been left alone, perhaps deliberately, perhaps as a test. Her trunk sat in the corner upstairs, secrets hidden within, but she could not spend the day haunting her room like a prisoner. There were necessities to be bought and appearances to maintain. She pinned on her bonnet, wrapped her shawl tight, and stepped out into the crisp morning. The town spread before her in sharp lines and raw edges, the church spire catching the light, the saloon doors yawning open already, the hammering of some carpenter repairing a porch. A dog barked, then slunk under a wagon when she passed. Eyes followed her. Men leaned on fence rails, their conversation stalling as she walked by. A woman sweeping her step paused mid-stroke, broom bristles catching in the mud, her gaze traveling over Victoria's bonnet and gloves with a faint curl of the lip. Victoria held her head high and pressed on, though every step felt like a measure taken, a judgment weighed. The bell over the general store door jangled when she pushed it open. The scent of flour and tobacco greeted her, mingled with the sharp tang of kerosene. Behind the counter, Mr. Hargrave, the storekeeper, looked up from tallying his ledger. His gray mustache twitched, surprise hidden behind politeness. "Well now," he said, "sheriff's bride. Mrs. Mercer, isn't it?" Victoria drew a steadying breath, her gloved hands clasping her reticule tighter. "Yes, I thought I'd see to some supplies." Of course, of course." His eyes lingered on her a fraction too long, already measuring how much she might know, how much she might spend. "Folks have been curious to meet you." From the corner, two women bent over bolts of calico cloth, whispering low. They did not bother to stop when Victoria entered. Their eyes flicked up, sharp with interest, then returned to their murmuring, words carrying just enough. "Boston bride, thin as paper, too fine for here." Victoria kept her back straight as she moved deeper into the store. She had crossed more dangerous rooms than this, but never one where the weapons were whispers. The wooden floor creaked beneath Victoria's boots as she moved toward the shelves stacked with tins of coffee and sacks of flour. Her gloved hand hovered over a basket of dried beans, then withdrew. She was aware of every glance in the room. Mr. Hargrave shuffled around the counter, puffing his chest with the kind of cheer meant to draw an audience. "You'll be wanting staples, I expect. Salt, flour, sugar, though prices run high, what with the railroad slow to deliver." Before Victoria could reply, one of the women at the calico boat sidled closer, her voice honeyed but sharp. "My, you've such fine gloves. Must be hard to keep them clean out here." The other woman chuckled behind her hand. Victoria offered a small smile, neither warm nor cold. "Clean gloves are only a matter of care." The first woman tilted her head. "Care, yes, though prairie dust don't much mind how fine a lady you are." Mr. Hargrave cleared his throat, perhaps uneasy at the edge in her tone. "Mrs. Mercer, may I introduce Mrs. Fletcher and Mrs. Walters? They keep the church circles lively." "Too lively, some say," Mrs. Fletcher quipped, her eyes sliding over Victoria again. "Tell us, dear, was it Boston?" "I heard Boston." "Boston," echoed Mrs. Walters, as though the word itself were suspicious. Victoria adjusted her shawl, her posture composed. "Yes, though the city has a way of shrinking once you've left it." Mrs. Fletcher's brow arched, as if searching for mockery in the reply. Before she could press further, the bell jangled again, and a pair of ranch hands stepped in, spurs jangling, laughter booming. They fell silent when they spotted Victoria. One gave a low whistle, quickly smothered under Mr. Hargrave's frown. "Sheriff keeps his house in order, I see," one of them muttered. Victoria felt the heat of their gaze but did not turn. She placed a small list on the counter, her handwriting neat, her voice steady. "If you'd be so kind, Mr. Hargrave." The women exchanged another whisper, too quiet to catch. But Victoria knew the rhythm of suspicion when it wound itself tight. The town was watching, measuring, waiting for the seam in her story to split. The bell above the store door jingled again, softer this time. Reverend Henry Cartwright stepped inside, his tall frame filling the entrance, his black coat sharp against the pale morning light. He removed his hat with a smooth gesture, surveying the room. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice warm enough to thaw frost, but with an edge, as though he were already delivering judgment from the pulpit. "Settling in, I trust?" Victoria inclined her head, the faintest curve of a smile on her lips. "As well as one might, Reverend." The women at the calico bolts exchanged looks, suddenly hushed, eyes flicking between them like sparrows sensing a hawk. Reverend Henry moved closer, his steps deliberate. "This town prides itself on its order, Mrs. Mercer, on good wives, strong families, and honest work. A sheriff's bride is not merely a wife, you see. She is an example." Victoria's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of her shawl, but her voice remained even. "Examples can be useful things, Reverend, though sometimes they are more pleasant in theory than in practice." The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile. "I should like to call upon you soon, for prayer, of course, and guidance. The sooner you find your footing among us, the sooner the town will feel at ease." It was phrased as kindness. It landed as a command. Victoria met his gaze directly, her eyes steady. I am sure the town will find me less remarkable once it grows accustomed to me. A beat of silence. Then Reverend Henry replaced his hat, nodding as though she had passed some quiet test. We shall see. He turned and left, the bell chiming sharply in his wake. The two women bent close together again, whispering furiously now. Mr. Hargrave busied himself with Victoria's order, his pencil scratching fast, as though eager not to be caught in the currents that had just passed. Victoria stood straighter, her heartbeat quick but her face composed. The Reverend had been clear enough she would be watched, closely. With her parcels wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, Victoria stepped back onto the boardwalk. The air outside felt sharper, as if the Reverend's words still clung to it. She walked with measured steps, bonnet angled just so, though the weight of eyes seemed to follow her still. At the far end of the street, laughter spilled from swinging doors. The saloon, its paint sun-faded, its windows cloudy with dust, yet alive with music and voices even at this hour. She quickened her pace, intent on passing unnoticed. Now there's a picture. The voice was low, lilting, female. Victoria turned her head. Anne Fletcher leaned against one of the saloon's porch posts, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a glass of whiskey in her hand though it was barely noon. Her auburn hair was pinned loose, a strand curling over her cheek. She watched Victoria with eyes sharp as glass, a smile tugging one corner of her mouth. Sheriff's bride, Anne drawled, lifting her glass in a half salute. Parading down Main Street with calico and beans, looking like she stepped off the Boston stage yesterday. Victoria adjusted the parcels in her arms, her back straighter. I prefer to think of it as walking, not parading. Anne chuckled, low and rich. Fair enough still, folks will talk whether you strut or tiptoe. That's the way of it. Do they talk about you? The question left Victoria before she could stop it. Anne's smile sharpened. Constantly. I make sure of it. Better to give 'em a story than let 'em invent one. She sipped her drink, eyes never leaving Victoria's face. You look like a woman guarding something tight, and in this town that just makes the whispers louder. The air between them hummed, not unfriendly but edged with dangerous understanding. Victoria dipped her head, the smallest concession. Perhaps I'm guarding nothing at all. Anne laughed, full and sudden, startling a pair of cowhands loitering nearby. If that's true, darling, then you're the finest actress this town's ever seen. Her laughter followed Victoria as she walked on, parcels clutched close. Yet beneath the sting of the words was something else, an odd flicker of relief. For Anne Fletcher, unlike the others, hadn't seemed interested in tearing her down, only in seeing her clearly. And that was unsettling enough. The parcels cut into Victoria's arms as she made her way back along the boardwalk, head held high, pace deliberate. The town seemed smaller now, its streets narrowing as though every building leaned closer to listen. Near the livery, two men leaned against a fence rail, their conversation drifting easily until she passed. Then it sharpened, lowered. Boston bride, one muttered, the words carrying clear enough. Won't last, the other replied, spitting into the dust. Women like that don't stick. Not here. Victoria's steps did not falter, though her pulse quickened. She fixed her gaze ahead, willing herself deaf. But the first voice spoke again, softer now, almost thoughtful. She's got the look, like she's keeping something back. Their laughter followed her down the street, rough and careless. By the time she reached the sheriff's house, her hands ached from gripping the parcels. She set them down on the table, smoothing her skirts with a steadiness she did not feel. The words clung to her, as if carried inside with the dust. Boston bride. Won't last. Keeping something back. She straightened, shoulders squared, and told herself she had survived worse than whispers. Yet in this town she knew, whispers had teeth. The skillet hissed as fat hit the iron, curling smoke into the rafters. Victoria stood over the stove in her plainest dress, like sleeves pinned back, her hair tucked severely beneath a kerchief. The smell of frying bacon clung to her clothes already, stubborn and unrefined. Behind her, Ruth leaned against the table, arms crossed, watching like a hawk. You're burning it, the girl declared. Victoria prodded the strips with a fork, their edges crisping dark. They'll be fine. Ma never burnt bacon. The words landed like stones. Victoria kept her face calm, though her grip on the fork tightened. I imagine your mother was very skilled. She didn't fuss with forks neither, Used her fingers. Perhaps her fingers were tougher than mine. Ruth gave a snort, half laugh, half scorn, and plucked a slice of bread from the counter. She tore at it with her teeth, crumbs scattering. The back door opened, boots striking wood. John stepped in, dusting his hat against his thigh before hanging it on the peg. His eyes flicked to the stove, then to Ruth. "You'll eat what's put before you," he said evenly. Ruth chewed slower but didn't answer. John moved to the basin, splashing water over his hands, scrubbing hard, as though the morning itself clung too close. "Breakfast'll do," he added without much inspection. Victoria placed the bacon on a plate, arranging it neat despite its edges gone too dark. She added eggs, their yolks soft, and set the dish on the table with quiet precision. Ruth eyed it skeptically. "Ma's eggs never ran." "Ruth," John warned, his tone carrying more weight this time. The girl slouched into her chair, muttering under her breath. Victoria sat opposite, folding her hands briefly before reaching for her own fork. She forced a small smile toward Ruth in offering, "Perhaps tomorrow you can show me how your mother did it." For the briefest instant, Ruth's eyes flickered, surprise, almost interest, but it closed again, just as quick, shutters slamming. "Don't think it helped," she said, stabbing at her egg. The clink of cutlery filled the silence. Victoria chewed slowly, each bite heavy with the taste of failure. When the dishes were stacked in the basin, John wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and pushed his chair back. "I'll be at the jailhouse most of the day," he said, already reaching for his hat. His gaze slid to Victoria. "You'll need flour and lamp oil. Ruth can carry." Ruth's head snapped up. "I got school." "You'll stop at the store first," John interrupted, his tone final. He placed his hat firmly on his head. "See she gets what's needed." Ruth glared at Victoria as though the errand had been her invention. John left with his usual quiet stride, the door closing solidly behind him. A long silence stretched between stepmother and daughter until Ruth finally shoved her slate into her satchel. "You'll just slow me down." Victoria tied her bonnet strings beneath her chin, her expression smooth. "Then I'll do my best to keep up." They walked the boardwalk side by side, Ruth half a pace ahead, her steps quick and jerky. Dust lifted around their skirts as wagons rolled past. A few townsfolk tipped their hats to Ruth. "Mornin', Miss Mercer." But their eyes lingered on Victoria. Two women paused outside the millinery, speaking in lowered voices until the pair drew close. Then the whispers sharpened, pitched just loud enough to carry. "Boston bride. Won't last a winter." Victoria kept her chin level, her eyes on the general store ahead. But Ruth's head turned sharply, catching the whispers full in her ears. The girl's jaw tightened. She walked faster, voice low and biting. "They already know you don't belong. Don't matter how many eggs you cook or how you smile at Pa." Victoria matched her pace, her voice even. "Belonging isn't always about what others decide." Ruth shot her a sideways look, sharp as glass. "Then you've never lived here." They reached the general store steps in brittle silence, the bell above the door jangling as Ruth pushed it open harder than necessary. Part 2. Chapter 4. Uneasy Footing. Part 2. A town errand with Ruth. John sends Victoria and Ruth into town together. The trip is tense. Ruth resists, mocks her. Victoria catches townsfolk whispering again, now in front of Ruth, which fuels the girl's hostility. When the dishes were stacked in the basin, John wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and pushed his chair back. "I'll be at the jailhouse most of the day," he said, already reaching for his hat. His gaze slid to Victoria. "You'll need flour and lamp oil. Ruth can carry." Ruth's head snapped up. "I got school." "You'll stop at the store first," John interrupted, his tone final. He placed his hat firmly on his head. "See she gets what's needed." Ruth glared at Victoria as though the errand had been her invention. John left with his usual quiet stride, the door closing solidly behind him. A long silence stretched between stepmother and daughter until Ruth finally shoved her slate into her satchel. "You'll just slow me down." Victoria tied her bonnet strings beneath her chin, her expression smooth. "Then I'll do my best to keep up." They walked the boardwalk side by side, Ruth half a pace ahead, her steps quick and jerky. Dust lifted around their skirts as wagons rolled past. A few townsfolk tipped their hats to Ruth. "Mornin', Miss Mercer." But their eyes lingered on Victoria. Two women paused outside the millinery, speaking in lowered voices until the pair drew close. Then the whispers sharpened, pitched just loud enough to carry. Boston bride. Won't last a winter. Victoria kept her chin level, her eyes on the general store ahead. But Ruth's head turned sharply, catching the whispers full in her ears. The girl's jaw tightened. She walked faster, voice low and biting. They already know you don't belong. Don't matter how many eggs you cook or how you smile at Pa. Victoria matched her pace, her voice even. Belonging isn't always about what others decide. Ruth shot her a sideways look, sharp as glass. Then you've never lived here. They reached the general store steps in brittle silence, the bell above the door jangling as Ruth pushed it open harder than necessary. The shopping was finished quickly. Ruth snatched the flour from the shelf with a thud, and Victoria added lamp oil and coffee with quiet precision. They left the store in brittle silence, parcels in hand. Outside, the morning had grown busier. Wagons rattled past, children darted between them, laughter ringing against the clapboard storefronts. A chestnut horse hitched to a cart shied suddenly, spooked by a falling crate. The reins slipped from the driver's grasp. The horse reared, hooves striking the air. A boy no more than 10 was standing too close. In an instant, the cart lurched, and the child was flung into the dirt, his head striking hard. Gasps rose, shouts tangled. "Get the doctor," someone cried. "He's out to the ranch," another voice shouted back. The boy lay still, a gash above his brow streaming red. His mother fell to her knees beside him, keening, pressing her hands uselessly against the wound. Victoria's parcels dropped from her arms. She was moving before she thought, skirts gathered, boots sinking into the dust. "Let me," she said sharply, kneeling beside the child. The mother looked up, wild-eyed. "He's bleeding. Victoria took her wrist, firm but not cruel, guiding the hand away. "You'll make it worse. Hold him still instead." From her pocket she drew a folded handkerchief, pressing it hard against the wound. Blood seeped through quickly, warm and slick, but she adjusted the pressure with practiced hands, her movements sure. "Someone bring clean cloth," she barked, not looking up. The crowd hesitated, then a man tore off his neckerchief, thrusting it toward her. She swapped it swiftly, binding it tight around the boy's head. "Keep him upright," she instructed the mother. "Slow breaths, he's not lost." The boy stirred faintly, groaning. Relief rippled through the gathered crowd, then curiosity. Murmurs rose around her like wind and grass. "Knows what she's doing." "Where'd she learn that?" "Boston bride. What's her trade anyhow?" Victoria felt the eyes, the questions, but she kept her focus on the boy, steadying her hands, her voice calm. "He'll need rest. Keep him awake for a while. He'll mend." The mother clutched her child close, tears streaking her face. Bless you, Mrs. Mercer," someone supplied. And with that, the name carried across the square, heavy now with a different weight. Perfect. Now the Reverend sharpens the moment. Chapter 4, Uneasy Footing. Part 4, The Reverend's Suspicion. Reverend Henry appears, praising her quick thinking, but asking pointed questions about her experience. Victoria deflects, claiming she helped care for sick relatives back east. His eyes suggest he does not believe her fully. The crowd was still parting when a tall shadow fell across the street. Reverend Henry Cartwright strode forward, his coat flaring with emotion, his presence as commanding as a bell toll. He glanced at the bloodied boy, now cradled against his mother's lap, then at Victoria, her hands stained red, her kerchief knotted firm. His lips curved in something like approval, though his eyes told another story. "Well done, Mrs. Mercer," he said, voice carrying to the gathered onlookers. "Quick hands save lives. God must have guided yours today." Victoria rose slowly, dust streaking her skirts, the knot of bloodied cloth still tight in her fingers. "Anyone could have done the same." "Not anyone," Henry replied smoothly. His gaze lingered on the boy's neat bandage. "That was no simple patch. You've a practiced touch." The murmurs thickened again, shifting now toward speculation. Victoria forced her breath even. "My mother fell ill often. There was no physician near, so I learned what I could, from books mostly." "Books," Henry echoed, his tone mild but his eyes intent. "And yet your work was swift, confident." Victoria met his stare without flinching. "When one has no choice, Reverend, one learns quickly." A hush settled around them. The boy whimpered faintly. His mother hushed him, rocking in the dust. Henry inclined his head at last, as though satisfied outwardly. "The Lord grants talents where he will. Perhaps he has set you here for just such needs." The words sounded like blessing, but underneath lay a thread of warning. Victoria dipped her head. Perhaps. Henry let the silence stretch another beat before stepping back, his gaze sliding briefly to Ruth, who stood stiffly on the boardwalk, her eyes narrowed not with awe, but with something colder. The boy was carried off, his mother clutching him tight, the crowd dissolving into murmurs that trailed after Victoria like birds caught in cloth. She gathered her parcels again, fingers still sticky with dried blood, and turned toward home. Ruth followed a pace behind, silent, her satchel slapping against her hip with each step. They walked past the churchyard, past the blacksmith's clang, the town slowly returning to its noise. But Ruth's silence was heavier than all of it. At last she spoke, her voice low, cutting. You tied that bandage like you'd done it 100 times. Victoria kept her eyes forward. I told the Reverend I learned caring for my mother. That was no mother's trick. Ruth's footsteps quickened, catching her at the shoulder. You knew exactly where to press, how to stop it, like a doctor. Victoria glanced at her then, steady. A doctor would have done better. Ruth's eyes narrowed further, her mouth twisting. You're lying. They stopped at the corner where the boardwalk met the dusty road, the house in sight. A wagon rattled past, masking the moment. Victoria lowered her voice, calm, deliberate. You don't know me well enough to say what I am. Ruth's chin jutted. I know you're not what you pretend. Their gazes held, a taut string stretched between them. Then Ruth jerked ahead, stomping up the walk toward the house, leaving Victoria in the settling dust. Victoria stood a moment longer, blood still drying beneath her nails, before following. The whispers of the town had grown sharper that day, but Ruth's words cut the deepest. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, rich and dark. Victoria poured carefully into 3 mismatched cups, the steam curling against her face. The stove still radiated heat from the morning's work. Bacon fried, eggs set, biscuits pulled from the oven with mitts that had already gone threadbare at the corners. John sat at the head of the table, knife in hand, slicing into a biscuit with slow precision. His shoulders looked heavier this morning, as though the badge pinned to his chest had gained weight overnight. Ruth sat opposite him, arms folded, her plate untouched. She hadn't looked at Victoria once since she entered the room. Victoria set the last plate before her, the biscuits warm, the bacon done properly this time, lightly crisp, no burn. Eat while it's hot, she said softly. Ruth's eyes stayed fixed on the tabletop. I'm not hungry. John chewed, the scrape of his knife against the plate loud in the silence. He swallowed, then spoke without looking up. You'll eat. Don't make me tell you again. Ruth picked up her fork, prodded a piece of egg, then let it fall. Still, she did not raise her eyes. Victoria sat down, folding her hands briefly before reaching for her own biscuit. She buttered it slowly, carefully, as though precision might anchor the room's shifting air. Would you like honey? She asked Ruth, her tone even, offering peace. No answer. Only the scrape of the fork pushed once more across the plate. John looked from one to the other, his jaw tight. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then shut it again, returning to his meal with deliberate bites. The house seemed to breathe in the silence, floorboards creaking faintly, stove ticking as it cooled, the hum of a fly against the window pane. Victoria swallowed a bite of biscuit, dry in her throat. She felt the girl's silence like a wall, higher than yesterday, reinforced with every unspoken word. When John finally rose from the table, setting his cup down with a dull thud, the air seemed to ease only slightly. I'll be at the jail, he said, reaching for his hat. His eyes brushed over Ruth, then Victoria, but he offered no more. The door shut behind him. Still Ruth did not speak. The sun was already high when Victoria stepped onto the boardwalk, parasol shading her face from the glare. She carried a small basket, an errand to the grocer, her excuse to leave the house heavy with Ruth's silence. The town bustled in its ordinary way, wagons rolling, chickens scratching loose near the feed store, the ring of a hammer from the smithy. Yet she felt the eyes, not openly hostile, not yet, but lingering, curious, measuring. Mrs. Mercer? The voice came sweet, lilting, and when Victoria turned, she found Anne stepping down from her boarding house porch, skirts rustling in brisk elegance. Anne's hair was tucked neat beneath a fashionable hat, her smile too bright to be simple courtesy. Victoria inclined her head politely. Good morning, Mrs. Harding. Anne's gaze swept her up and down, not missing a detail. I was just saying to the Reverend yesterday how remarkable you were, saving that boy. She clasped her hands to her breast, eyes wide with feigned admiration. Such composure, such skill. Why, you might have been trained. I did only what was needed, Victoria said evenly. Anne's smile tilted. Of course, but still, where does a lady learn such firm hands? Not in a parlor, I imagine. A few passers-by slowed, pretending not to listen. Anne's voice carried lightly, conversational, yet her words landed sharp as pins. Victoria kept her parasol steady. My mother's health was poor. Necessity taught me more than I would have wished. Ah. Anne drew the syllable out, eyes narrowing with pleasant suspicion. How very dutiful of you. But one wonders, did you tend only to your family? Or perhaps others? Victoria's lips curved faintly, though it was not a smile. The sick don't much care who brings relief, only that someone does. Anne's laugh rang out, light and false. How very practical. I'll be sure to tell the ladies at Sewing Circle. They do love a story. She touched Victoria's arm briefly, warm, perfumed, invasive, and then swept on down the boardwalk, and her parasol snapping open in a flourish. The two men loitering outside the barber's were already whispering by the time Victoria moved past. The kindling Anne had scattered caught flame quickly in such dry air. Victoria's grip tightened on her basket. She had seen gossip spread before, like fever through a town. Once it began, it seldom burned out on its own. The bell above the general store door jangled as Victoria stepped inside. The air smelled of leather, coffee beans, and the faint tang of kerosene. Behind the counter stood Ezekiel, tall and wiry, his spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. He greeted her with his usual nod, though his complexion looked pale beneath the lamplight. "Morning, Mrs. Mercer?" he rasped. "Morning, Mr. Ezekiel," she replied, setting her basket on the counter. "I'll need sugar and a spool of white thread if you've got it." He turned, reaching to the high shelf. His hand wavered. A sudden cough racked him, harsh, dry at first, then deeper, tearing. He caught the shelf to steady himself, but his knees buckled, and in an instant he slumped forward against the counter. The spool of thread rolled across the boards, forgotten. "Mr. Ezekiel?" Victoria darted forward, catching his shoulder before he slid fully to the floor. A woman near the bins of flour gasped. "Fetch the doctor. He's still out at the ranch," came the reply. Ezekiel's face reddened as he fought for breath, his chest rattling like a bellows near spent. Without thinking, Victoria eased him down to a sitting position, fingers quick at his collar. She loosened his shirt, tilted his chin upward to open the airway. "Breathe slow," she instructed firmly. "Steady now." He coughed again, weaker this time, but air came through. She pressed a hand to his back. "Steady, grounding. That's it. Don't fight it. Let it pass." The store had gone still except for his labored gasps. A half-dozen townsfolk stood clustered, eyes wide, whispers already flitting. "She knows what she's doing. Did you see? Straight to the collar, like she was trained. Boston bride's no ordinary bride." Ezekiel sagged back, the color slowly returning to his cheeks. He raised a trembling hand, embarrassed. "Fool spell comes on me sudden sometimes." Victoria helped him lean against the counter, her face calm though her pulse hammered. "You'll be well now, but take water and rest. Your lungs are strained." The words slipped out, precise, unguarded. The murmur sharpened. Strained lungs sounds like a physician talking. Or a nurse. Or something else. Ezekiel gave her a grateful look, but it was lost beneath the crowd's eyes, all fixed on her with renewed suspicion. Victoria wiped her hands discreetly against her skirts, aware that she had once again revealed more than she wished. The house was dim by lantern light, the day's heat still lingering in the walls. Ruth had already retreated to her room, her door shut with the sharp finality of a slammed book. Victoria sat at the table, mending one of John's shirts by the flickering flame. The needle moved steadily, stitch by stitch, though her thoughts churned faster than her hands. The door opened, boots sounding heavy across the boards. John set his hat on the peg, the badge on his chest catching the light as he moved toward her. He paused, watching her a moment longer than usual. "You were busy today?" he said at last. She tied off the thread, not looking up. "I only ran errands." He pulled out the chair opposite, sat down, and folded his hands on the table. His eyes, clear and steady, fixed on her. "Folks are talking. Said you near brought Ezekiel back from death's door." Her needle stilled. She forced her hand to move again. "He had a spell, I helped him breathe easier, nothing more. John leaned back, his chair creaking. They said it weren't nothing. Said you handled it calm, like you'd done it before. Same as with the boy. Victoria finally set the needle aside, the shirt folded neatly in her lap. Would you rather I stood idle while a child bled or a man choked? His jaw tightened, but he shook his head. No, I'm glad you helped. Grateful. His voice softened, but the weight in it remained. But you've got more in you than you've said. That much is plain. The lantern hissed faintly, the silence stretching. Victoria met his gaze, her voice low but firm. I've told you the truth of my life. There's no more than what I've said. John studied her, the sheriff's steadiness in his eyes. He didn't argue further, but neither did he yield. The air between them held the words unspoken. At last he rose, sliding the chair back slowly. I'll not press you tonight, but this town, it don't take kindly to mysteries. He hung his badge on the peg beside his hat and disappeared into the back room, leaving Victoria in the hush of the lantern glow, the needle cooling in her hand. All right, let's close out Chapter 5 with Ruth tightening the noose of suspicion. Chapter 5, Fault Lines. Part 5, Ruth's Threat. Ruth corners Victoria privately, declaring she'll find out what's being kept secret. Her suspicion has shifted into determination, setting up greater conflict in the household. The lantern in the kitchen had burned low when Victoria finally rose from her chair, folding the mended shirt over her arm. She moved quietly toward her room. The house hushed, only the faint creak of timber and the far-off cry of a night bird. As she reached for the door, a shadow slipped from the hallway. Ruth stood there barefoot, her nightdress whispering against the boards. Her eyes glittered in the dim light, sharp even in the dark. You lied to him, the girl said flatly. Victoria kept her hand on the doorknob steady. You ought to be in bed, Ruth. Ruth stepped closer, chin lifted. You told Pa you said everything about yourself, but I heard you today. The words you used with Ezekiel, they weren't from books. You've done this before. Victoria drew in a slow breath. Sometimes experience teaches what books can't. Whose experience? Ruth's voice cut like glass. Yours? Or some doctor you follow back east? Maybe you worked for one. Maybe you're not even who you say. Victoria turned, facing her fully now, her expression calm though her pulse thudded at her throat. You're letting gossip fill your head. That can be dangerous. Ruth's lips curled in something close to a smile, though it held no warmth. Maybe, but I'll find out. I always do. For a heartbeat, the house seemed to hold its breath. Victoria at the door, Ruth in the shadows, the silence between them sharp and alive. Then Ruth stepped back, retreating in the dark, her bare feet whispering against the floorboards as she vanished into her room. Victoria exhaled, her hand still on the door, the girl's words echoing long after her footsteps faded. The mercantile was crowded that morning, voices overlapping in a low hum, as women chose bolts of cloth and men fetched nails, lamp oil, and tobacco. The air smelled of dust, flour, and pickled goods in their brine. Victoria stood at the counter, waiting her turn with a small list in hand. She kept her posture straight, her bonnet tied tight beneath her chin. The whispers had grown bolder these last days. She felt them on her back like gnats. Near the bins of beans, two women spoke in tones pitched just above a murmur. Anne's guest, did you hear? Came down with a fever in the night, shaking something terrible. The other clucked her tongue. Boarding house stew, no doubt. She don't wash her pots near proper. Victoria's hand tightened around her basket handle. A chill threaded through her spine. Fever, sudden, violent. Her mind cataloged the pattern without permission. The first woman went on. Anne says it's nothing, but she sent her boy running for willow bark at dawn. Man's near boiled alive with heat, she said, sweating through the sheets. The second shrugged. Bad meat'll do it. He'll be right in a day or two. Victoria turned slightly, pretending to examine a jar of preserves, her ear keen to every word. The dismissiveness in their tone twisted her stomach. She had seen towns wave off the first spark of sickness before, only to watch the blaze spread. Her pulse quickened. If it was what she feared, Anne's boarding house, with its constant flow of travelers, close quarters, and shared meals, was the worst place it could begin. But she said nothing. Not yet. When her turn at the counter came, she handed Ezekiel her list with steady hands. Coffee, soap, a measure of flour. Her voice betrayed nothing. Still, as she left the store, basket light on her arm, her mind carried a weight she could not set down. The kitchen smelled faintly of lye soap and wood smoke when Victoria returned. She set her basket on the table, unwrapping the flour sack and placing the coffee tin on the shelf. Ruth sat nearby, her slate and chalk before her, though the marks were more idle doodles than sums. "You were long enough," the girl muttered, not lifting her head. "There was talk at the store," Victoria said, more to herself than to Ruth. She stacked the soap bars, her voice thoughtful. "A guest at Anne's boarding house has taken fever." Ruth's chalk stilled. She looked up, eyes sharp. "Plenty get fevers. Bad stew, most like." "Perhaps," Victoria murmured, brushing flour dust from her skirt. "But sudden chills and high heat, that doesn't sound like spoiled meat." The words slipped free before she could catch them. Ruth straightened, chalk gripped tight. "How would you know that?" Victoria turned, schooling her expression into calm. "Common sense. Anyone who's cared for an ill family member would know." Ruth narrowed her eyes. "You said that before. About your mother. But you talk different. Like you've studied it. Like you've seen more than one sickbed." Victoria crossed to the stove, busying her hands with the kettle, though it was already full. "I've seen enough." The girl's stare lingered, sharp, probing. "You're hiding something. I'll find it." Her voice carried no heat this time, only a cold certainty, as though she had already begun piecing the puzzle together. Victoria set the kettle back on the hob and turned, her expression steady. "Then you'll waste your time chasing shadows." Ruth smirked faintly, lifting her chalk again. "We'll see." The scratching of chalk filled the room once more, but the silence beneath it was pointed, alive. The afternoon light slanted low through the parlor window, striping the floorboards in gold. Victoria was darning a pair of John's socks when a firm knock sounded at the door. Ruth, sprawled on the rug with her slate, glanced up sharply. "That'll be the Reverend," she said, a touch too knowingly. Victoria hesitated only a moment before smoothing her skirt and rising. She opened the door to find Henry Cartwright standing tall on the step, his hat in his hand, his expression a mask of courtesy. "Mrs. Mercer," he greeted, bowing his head slightly. "Might I step inside a moment?" "Of course." She stood aside, and he entered with measured steps, his boots clean despite the dusty road. He removed his coat and draped it neatly over his arm before taking a chair at the table. Ruth hovered nearby, watching with sharp interest. Henry's gaze rested on Victoria, calm but intent. "I've come on a simple errand, no trouble. Word reaches me of your kindness these past days. The boy in the street, Mr. Ezekiel in his shop. And today I hear whispers of your concern for Anne's lodger." Victoria folded her hands in her lap, keeping her voice even. "When one sees another in need, it is only right to help." "Indeed," Henry agreed, his tone warm, though his eyes searched. "And yet not everyone knows how to help so swiftly. You act not from guesswork, but from knowledge." Ruth shifted on the rug, her lips twitching as though she'd like to speak but dared not. Victoria forced a small smile. "Books, Reverend. My mother's sickness kept me near her bedside more often than I liked. One learns." Henry studied her for a long moment, fingers drumming lightly against his hat brim. At last he nodded. "The Lord grants different talents to each of us. Yours, it seems, run uncommon." The words might have been praise, but they landed like warning. He rose smoothly, slipping his coat back over his arm. "This town is a small one, Mrs. Mercer. Secrets seldom remain secrets long. I'd counsel openness where possible. It spares harder reckonings later." Victoria stood as he did, her expression composed though her stomach tightened. "I appreciate your counsel." Henry inclined his head once more and stepped out into the fading light. The door closed. The parlor felt smaller, quieter, as though his presence still lingered. From the rug, Ruth spoke at last, her voice low and cutting. "He sees it too." The clang of hammer on iron rang down Main Street as Victoria carried her basket past the blacksmith's. The air was sharp with smoke and hot metal, sparks leaping like fireflies from the anvil. A cluster of women stood outside the general store, gossiping as they waited on their purchases. Among them was Elizabeth Turner, young and fair, her bonnet tilted back to show her flushed face. She laughed at something said, then stopped short, her hand pressed to her brow. "Lizzie?" one of the women asked. Elizabeth swayed, her cheeks red as coals. It's too hot." Her words broke into a cough. Then she crumpled onto the packed dirt, skirts pooling around her. The street froze for a moment. Then voices rose in alarm. "Fetch water! Get the doctor!" A man broke from the crowd, shaking his head. "He's 2 days' ride out, tending the McPherson girl." Elizabeth writhed, her skin damp with sweat, her eyes glassy. The blacksmith dropped his hammer, rushing forward but uncertain what to do once he knelt beside her. Victoria's basket slipped from her arm, apples rolling across the dust. She pushed through the ring of onlookers, her bonnet falling loose against her neck. "Give her air," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the din. She knelt, loosening Elizabeth's collar, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "She's burning." A woman clutched her apron, eyes wide. "Bad stew again, surely." Victoria shook her head before she could stop herself. "This isn't food." The words hung in the air like a stone dropped into a still pond. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People drew back, some in fear, others in suspicion. Elizabeth coughed again, weakly, her body trembling. Victoria held her hand steady on the girl's shoulder, her mind racing. 2 cases now. Both sudden, both with fever. This was no accident. Her throat tightened with the words she dared not speak aloud. Here's where Victoria must walk the razor's edge between knowledge and secrecy. Chapter 6. The First Signs. Part 5. The Unspoken Diagnosis. Victoria sees the symptoms plainly. This is no food sickness, but the start of something contagious. She nearly speaks the word aloud, then catches herself. The townsfolk look to her for answers. She gives careful instructions, but offers no name for the illness. Ruth watches, eyes narrowed, piecing together the truth. Elizabeth moaned, her breath shallow, damp strands of hair clinging to her cheeks. The heat pouring from her skin seemed to radiate into Victoria's own hands. The murmurs swelled around them. "Is it catching? Best not touch her." "Where's the doctor?" Victoria's mind leapt ahead, assembling the pieces with the swiftness of training she wasn't supposed to have. The fever, the chills, the sudden collapse. Not stew. Not a passing spell. A sickness that could move from body to body like wind through grass. She opened her mouth, then stopped. The name of it sat on her tongue, bitter as gall. To speak it now would set fire to the town, panic running faster than the sickness itself. Instead, she drew in a steadying breath. "Bring me clean cloths, cool water, quickly." The blacksmith's apprentice bolted toward the pump. A woman fetched rags from her basket. Victoria wrung one out, pressed it to Elizabeth's brow. "She needs rest, a quiet room away from others," Victoria instructed, her tone firm. "Not crowded in the heat. Keep her cool. Give her water as she wakes." The onlookers nodded, their fear tempered by her certainty. Still, eyes lingered on her, measuring, questioning. From the edge of the crowd, Ruth watched, her arms folded tight across her chest. Her sharp young eyes missed nothing. The sure way Victoria's hands moved, the caution in her voice, the silence where a name should have been. When Elizabeth was finally lifted and carried toward her mother's home, the crowd began to scatter, whispers trailing like smoke in the air. Victoria stooped to gather her spilled apples, her fingers trembling as she placed them back in the basket. She could feel Ruth's gaze on her still, steady, accusing, almost triumphant. And she knew the sickness had come. Here's the opening of Chapter 7, where the sickness grips the town in earnest. Chapter 7. The Sickness Spreads. Part 1. A town on edge, church bells toll not for service but for the sick, signaling families in need. Victoria walks through town, noticing shuttered windows, pale faces, and whispers as she passes. John urges calm, but even he cannot deny the rising fear. The bell tolled at mid-morning, slow and hollow, each strike shivering through the air. Not for Sunday service, not for a wedding. In this town, a bell at the wrong hour meant only one thing. Sickness had taken root. Victoria tightened her shawl around her shoulders as she walked down Main Street beside John. The sky was bright, the air clear, yet the town felt dimmed, as though the sound of that bell had cast a shadow over every doorstep. Windows were shuttered where yesterday they had been open. Doors cracked only wide enough for pale faces to peer out. Mothers drew their children close as Victoria passed, whispering low. Men who would normally tip their hats offered only curt nods, suspicion flickering in their eyes. John noticed it too. His hand hovered near hers as they walked, but his voice carried steady authority. "Folks'll stir themselves sick with fear if they're not careful. I'll speak with Henry. Keep the calm as best we can." Victoria glanced toward him, catching the faint tension in his jaw, the weight in his eyes that belied his words. Even John, with all his steadiness, could not ignore the fear seeping into the streets. They passed the mercantile, nearly empty now, save for a hurried clerk and one woman darting out with her parcels, avoiding Victoria's gaze. Across the way, the saloon was quiet as a tomb. Then the bell tolled again. Victoria felt it in her chest, a deep vibration that carried not just sound but dread. Each peal was a summons. Someone else had fallen ill. She held her basket tighter, the apples within shifting. Her thoughts raced ahead, symptoms, spread, patterns. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her steps measured. Beside her, John's voice was low, meant only for her. Stay close to the house when you can. People, they're looking at you different. Best not to give them reason to talk. Victoria nodded, though the truth pressed hard against her ribs. If she stayed behind walls while the sickness grew, it would not only be the town that paid the price, it would be her conscience. The air in the Mercer kitchen was heavy with the scent of boiled coffee and wood smoke. Victoria set her basket on the table, the apples rolling softly against one another. She reached for the kettle, trying to steady her hands, when Ruth's voice cut through the quiet. "You knew the bell would toll." Victoria froze. "What are you talking about?" Ruth stepped out from the doorway, her braid loose, chalk dust smudged on her fingers. "On the street." "You weren't surprised. Everyone else was looking around, counting the strikes. But you," her eyes narrowed, "you looked like you'd already been waiting for it." Victoria poured the coffee, letting the dark stream fill the tin cup. "You imagine things, Ruth. That bell shakes everyone." The girl's arms crossed tight. "Don't treat me like I'm simple. You know what this sickness is. You knew when that girl fell. You knew when Anne's lodger burned with fever. And you know it's not bad stew." Victoria set the kettle down harder than she meant, the clang sharp against the stove. She turned, meeting Ruth's stare. "Enough. You speak like a child poking at shadows." Ruth's chin lifted, defiance blazing in her eyes. "You're lying. To me, to Pa, to everyone. You've got training, more than a woman's supposed to. You hide it because you'd rather trick your way here than tell the truth." Her voice rose with each word, and Victoria's glance darted toward the closed door to the front room where John read his paper. "Keep your voice down," she hissed. Ruth's smirk returned, cold and certain. "Why? Afraid he'll hear? Afraid he'll ask the same questions I do?" The silence that followed was taut, crackling like a storm held in the clouds. Finally, Ruth spoke again, softer but more dangerous. "I'll find it out, even if you keep shutting me down. I'll uncover what you're hiding, and then Pa will see you for what you are." She spun on her heel and left the room, her footsteps sharp on the floorboards, the door to her room slamming like a gavel. Victoria stood alone, breath unsteady, the coffee growing cold in her hand. Here comes the turning point in town. The sickness strikes in public. Chapter 7. The sickness spreads. Part 3. Walter's collapse. At the saloon, Walter, the ranch hand, collapses mid-laugh, sweating and coughing violently. Victoria rushes forward, her instincts taking over. This time, Ezekiel mutters darkly about her knowing too much, and the crowd murmurs agreement. The saloon doors swung wide on a gust of laughter. Walter strode out into the late afternoon sun, his boots striking dust from the street. A cluster of ranch hands followed, voices loud, joking after too many mugs of ale. "Tell it again, Walt," one of them crowed. Walter grinned, lifting a hand as though to launch into another story. But the grin faltered. He pressed his chest, coughed once, then doubled over with a hacking fit that bent him near in half. The laughter died at once. "Walter?" one of the men asked, stepping forward uncertainly. The cough deepened, ragged, tearing. Walter staggered, his face flushed, sweat springing to his brow. He reached for the hitching post but missed, collapsing into the dirt with a heavy thud. A cry went up. "Fetch the doctor." "He ain't here," another snapped. The small crowd drew back in a ring, fear written on every face. Victoria had been crossing the street with her basket, the sound of the cough turning her blood cold. By the time Walter fell, she was already running. The basket dropped, rolling against the dust, forgotten. She knelt in the dirt, rolling Walter gently onto his side. His shirt clung damp to his back, his breath short and wheezing. "Bring water," she commanded, her voice low, but certain. "Cool cloths, if you've got them." The ranch hands looked at one another, uncertain, but one bolted toward the pump. Another tore off his neckerchief, handing it to her. As she pressed the cloth to Walter's flushed face, a voice cut through the crowd, sharp as a knife. "She always knows, don't she?" Victoria glanced up. Ezekiel stood on the boardwalk outside his shop, arms folded, eyes narrowed. "Boy bleeds in the street, she's there. Ezek Turner coughs, she fixes him. Now Walt goes down and she's on him like she was waiting." A ripple of unease moved through the bystanders. "She knows too much," Ezekiel said darkly. "More than she ought to." Murmurs swelled. Agreement, doubt, suspicion. Some stepped closer, peering at Victoria with eyes no longer grateful but wary. Walter groaned, his body trembling. Victoria kept her hands steady, though the back of her neck burned under the weight of their stares. "Stay calm," she said firmly, not looking up. "He'll breathe easier soon." But the whispers kept circling, closing in like wolves. The murmurs swelled around her, suspicion spreading faster than the fever itself. Victoria kept her hand pressed firm to Walter's shoulder, but the air seemed to tilt against her, heavy with doubt. Then boots struck the boardwalk hard. "Enough." John's voice cut clean through the noise. He strode into the circle, hat pulled low, badge gleaming in the slant of sun. His eyes swept the crowd, cold steel behind them. "She's done nothing but help," he said, standing square between Victoria and the ring of townsfolk. "You want to turn your backs on a man choking in the dirt? Or let a woman do the good the Lord put in her hands?" The mutters quieted. No one met his gaze. Ezekiel scowled but said nothing more, retreating a step into the shadow of his awning. John crouched then, his hand brushing Victoria's arm. "Go on," he murmured. "Do what you can. I'll see no one hinders you." Walter stirred weakly, groaning. Victoria gave him another sip of water, coaxing it past his lips. Gradually his breath eased, though the heat still radiated from him. The men lifted him finally, carrying him toward the bunkhouse. The crowd drifted apart, the danger of it dispersing for now. But the stares lingered. The questions hung unspoken in the dust. That evening, the kitchen lamp burned low as Victoria scrubbed Walter's fever from her hands, though the smell of sickness clung stubbornly. John sat at the table, his paper folded, unread. He spoke without looking up. "They're talking now, not just behind doors. You know that." Victoria dried her hands on a cloth, her back to him. "They'll forget in time." "No." His voice was firm, carrying a weight that made her turn. His eyes met hers, steady, unyielding. "They won't. Not unless you tell me what it is you're holding back." The silence pressed thick between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Victoria swallowed hard. "I've told you. Not enough." His hand curled on the table. "I can't keep standing in front of you if I don't know what I'm shielding." Her chest ached with the truth she dared not speak. If she gave it voice, the town might tear her apart. But if she stayed silent, the town might tear itself apart instead. She lowered her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "John, please, trust me a little longer." His chair scraped back as he rose. He lingered only a moment, looking down at her with an expression caught between love and doubt. Before he left the room, the door closing with quiet finality. Victoria stood alone, the lantern light trembling across the walls, her secret pressing harder than ever against her ribs. The night lay heavy over the Mercer homestead, the fields hushed beneath a silvered moon. Inside, the house was quiet save for the creak of timber settling and the slow tick of the clock on the mantel. Victoria lay awake, her eyes tracing the ceiling beams in the dark. John's steady breathing came faintly from the next room. Ruth's door was closed, but the girl's suspicion lingered in Victoria's mind, sharp as ever. Then it came, soft at first, then harsher. A ragged cough carried through the still night air, not from within their walls, but from the neighboring house down the lane. It rose again, deeper, followed by a wheezing moan. Victoria sat up, her pulse quickening. Another cough tore through the quiet, followed by the sound of a woman's voice calling low, desperate, muffled by distance. She swung her feet to the floor. For a long moment she sat there, clutching her shawl, her body taut between two choices: stay in bed, let the night pass, keep her secret safe, or rise and answer what she knew too well was the beginning of something worse. The coughing came again, harsher still, and the choice was made. She lifted her lantern from the bedside, shielding the flame with her hand as she lit it. The soft glow filled the room, painting her face in pale gold. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and slipped from the room. The hallway was silent. Ruth's door stayed shut, but Victoria felt the weight of the girl's suspicion even in her absence. She pressed on, careful on the boards, then unlatched the front door. The cold night air rushed against her as she stepped outside. Lantern raised, she crossed the yard, the grass silvered beneath the moon, the coughing still echoing faintly from the neighbor's house. Each step carried her further from safety, deeper into the truth she could no longer keep hidden. The neighbor's cabin glowed faintly ahead, lamplight leaking through the chinks in the shutters. The coughing had not stopped. It rattled through the quiet night like the last beats of a drum. Victoria quickened her steps, shawl clutched tight against her throat. The door stood ajar, a child's frightened face peeking out. When he saw her lantern, he darted back inside. Victoria knocked once, softly, then pushed through. The room was small, warm with the smell of sweat and wood smoke. A woman bent over the bed, wringing her hands. On the straw mattress lay her husband, his skin blotched red, shirt plastered with sweat. His chest heaved, each breath a battle. The woman turned, relief flashing in her eyes. "Oh, thank God! You came. He's burning alive." Victoria set her lantern down, rolling up her sleeves. She spoke steady, calm. "Fetch clean water, cloths as many as you can spare, and keep the children back." The woman scurried to obey. The children clustered in the corner, wide-eyed, whispering. Victoria pressed a hand to the man's brow, then his wrist. The pulse thundered beneath her fingers. His eyes fluttered open, glassy, searching. She murmured low, reassuring words, dabbing his face with the damp cloth once water was brought. She eased his shirt open, letting his body breathe in the stifling room. The family watched every movement, whispering among themselves. One child whispered, not as soft as he thought, "She knows what she's doing." Like the doctor. Victoria's hand faltered for only an instant. Then she resumed, wringing out the cloth again. The man's breath steadied slightly under her care, though the fever still roared through him. Behind her, the floor creaked. She turned just enough to glimpse the doorway. There in the shadows, Ruth stood. Her braid hung loose down her back, her face half hidden, but her eyes, those sharp accusing eyes, gleamed in the lamplight. Victoria's heart stuttered. Ruth had followed. Ruth had seen. The girl said nothing, only watched, her expression unreadable. Victoria turned back to the patient, her hands steady, though her pulse hammered in her ears. She could feel Ruth's gaze on her every movement, burning hotter than the fever she fought. The morning sun broke hard and bright over the rooftops, but the town itself seemed dim. Shutters were drawn along Main Street, doors latched tight. The bell tolled again, slower this time, the echo heavy with dread. Victoria walked with her shawl pulled close, basket at her side. The night still clung to her, the sweat-soaked sheets, the rasp of labored breathing, Ruth's eyes watching her from the shadows. As she passed the mercantile, she caught voices through the open doorway. "3 in the Harris house," someone muttered. "And the McClure baby down with fever." "The Lord have mercy." Victoria quickened her step. But the words followed her into the street, thick with suspicion. Near the pump, a knot of townsfolk had gathered. Anne stood among them, her bonnet crisp, her face bright with self-importance. "She was at the Turners last night," Anne said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Tending their man like a trained doctor. Where did she get that kind of learning, I ask you? And why does she keep it hid?" Murmurs rose, people nodding, others frowning. A farmer spat into the dust. "Maybe she brought it with her, came here with sickness on her skirts." "Or maybe she means well," someone else offered. But the words were softer, weaker, drowned by the louder doubts. Anne lifted her chin, smug. "It don't sit right. A woman who knows things she oughtn't. Not in a godly way." Victoria stood frozen at the corner, the crowd's words buzzing in her ears. Faces turned toward her, some wary, some outright hostile. She forced herself to keep walking, her steps even though her stomach clenched. Every toll of the bell seemed louder now, less like a warning and more like an accusation. The quarrel by the pump broke off in a sudden cry. A boy no more than 8 stumbled into the square, his mother chasing after him. His small body convulsed with a harsh cough, and then, before anyone could move, he crumpled onto the packed dirt, wheezing, face flushed scarlet. His mother dropped to her knees. "Help him! Please, someone help!" But the crowd hung back, skirts gathered, Hands lifted as though the sickness could leap across the air and seize them. One man muttered, "Don't touch him, it spreads." Another pulled his children closer, eyes wide with fear. The boy's chest hitched, his small hands clawing at the ground. His mother sobbed, looking around wildly. "Please, he can't breathe." Victoria's basket hit the ground with a thud as she pushed through the onlookers. "Give him space," she commanded, kneeling beside the boy. The mother clutched her sleeve. "Is he dying?" "No." Victoria's voice cut sharp, steady. "But he will if he's left like this." She eased the boy onto his side, fingers quick at his collar buttons to open his shirt, letting his chest rise easier. She propped him slightly with her shawl, tilting his head to keep his airway clear. Her hands moved sure, practiced, not the fumbling of a wife or neighbor, but the precision of someone who had done this before, many times. The boy gasped, coughed again, then pulled in a thin, rattling breath. His chest rose higher. His color eased from scarlet toward a mottled pink. The mother clung to him, sobbing thanks, but her gaze fixed on Victoria's hands with a mixture of gratitude and fear. Around them, the townsfolk stared. No one spoke. They watched every practiced motion, how she steadied his breathing, how she wiped the sweat from his brow, how she gave instructions in a low, sure tone. It was Ruth who broke the silence. She had slipped from the boardwalk into the square, her arms folded, her eyes glittering. "She knows what to do," the girl said, her voice carrying like a bell, "because she's a doctor." A murmur rippled through the crowd, sharper than before, suspicion breaking into something near outrage. The word hung in the air like a stone dropped in still water. "Doctor." The townsfolk shifted uneasily, the circle tightening around Victoria and the boy she cradled. Some faces brimmed with fear, others with awe, but suspicion burned brightest. Ezekiel Turner shoved forward, his boots grinding the dust. His eyes glinted with triumph as though Ruth herself had handed him a weapon. "A doctor?" His voice cracked sharp. "She admits it, does she? Lied to every one of us, slipped into this town under false pretenses, pretending she's just another woman come for marriage?" "I never," Victoria began, but Ezekiel's voice boomed over hers. "You think God gave a woman those tools? Those airs?" He jabbed a finger at her, his face red. "No, this is unnatural against the order of things. And worse, she's brought plague with her." The crowd murmured louder, the words swirling. Unnatural, brought it with her, lied. The boy whimpered against Victoria's arm. She held him tighter, keeping her gaze fixed steady though her stomach nodded. "Enough, Ezekiel." John's voice cut clean through, cold as iron. He pushed his way into the circle, planting himself between Victoria and the crowd. His hand rested on his belt, near the glint of his badge. "You'll not stand here and spit poison at my wife." "She's no wife," Ezekiel spat. "She's a liar, a deceiver." John's hand moved, swift, seizing Ezekiel by the front of his shirt. He hauled the man close, their faces inches apart. The crowd hushed. "One more word like that," John said, his voice low, "dangerous, and you'll answer to me, not her. You hear?" Ezekiel's bravado faltered. He jerked free, straightened his collar, but stepped back, muttering. John turned, his body still a shield before Victoria. "Get him inside," he told the boy's mother, she at once scooping her son into her arms and hurrying away. Only when the crowd thinned, drifting with whispers and uneasy glances, did John face Victoria fully. His jaw was tight, his eyes hard. "They'll not let this lie much longer," he said. His voice held no anger now, only weary certainty. "And neither will I." Victoria's throat tightened. "You can't keep silent," he continued, softer now, almost pleading. "Not with what's coming." Her eyes dropped to her hands, still damp from the boy's fever. She wanted to answer, to confess it all, but the words tangled like thorns in her chest. The bell tolled again, slow, heavy, as though echoing John's warning. The Mercer kitchen was dim, the single lantern burning low, shadows pooling in the corners. The day's clamor still echoed in Victoria's bones, the boy gasping in her arms, Ezekiel shouting, the crowd's eyes fixed sharp on her every movement. John sat at the table, hat tossed aside, his sleeves rolled. He had not touched his supper. His gaze stayed on her, steady, unyielding. "You can't outrun it now," he said quietly. Victoria set her hands flat on the table, palms damp. She could feel the grain of the wood against her skin, anchoring her, though her heart beat hard enough to shake her. "I wanted to tell you," she whispered. "Then tell me," he urged. "Tell me now, before the town tears it out of you." A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Victoria's head turned just enough to catch a sliver of shadow. Ruth lurking silent, her face half hidden but her eyes bright. The girl had been waiting for this, watching. Victoria closed her eyes. She saw again the fevered man in the neighbor's bed, the boy at the well, the way her hands had moved without hesitation, without permission. She could not deny it any longer. Not to John, not to Ruth, not to the town. When she opened her eyes, she met John's gaze square. She drew in a long breath, her voice trembling but certain. "There's something you both need to know." The lantern flickered, throwing her shadow tall across the wall as she prepared to speak. The lantern hissed softly, its flame low, its glow throwing uneven shadows across the Mercer kitchen. Victoria sat rigid at the table, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her hands clasped tight in her lap. John leaned forward, elbows on the wood, his face grave. Ruth hovered in the doorway, arms folded, a sharp light in her eyes. Victoria drew a breath that seemed to scrape against her ribs. "I wasn't born to be a farmer's wife," she began, her voice thin, "nor a mail-order bride. Before I came here, before all of this, I was a doctor." The words settled in the room like stones dropped in a still pond. Ruth straightened, her mouth curling in triumph. "I knew it," she whispered, almost gleeful. "I knew there was something. You think you can hide things from me? I watch, I listen." Victoria met the girl's gaze, not flinching. "Yes, Ruth, you saw true. I studied medicine back east, in Boston. Years of lectures, of practice, of nights so long I forgot the shape of morning. I worked in hospitals, tended to men broken by machines, children fevered, women bleeding in childbirth. That's where these hands learned what they do." John's eyes stayed fixed on her, unblinking, his face unreadable. Ruth's arms dropped to her sides. "But that's unnatural for a woman." Her voice faltered, the certainty warring with a flicker of unease. "That's why you hide it, isn't it?" Victoria's throat tightened. She nodded once. "They said no woman should take up a man's work, the jeers, the doors closed, the patients who'd rather die than be touched by me. And then," her voice caught. She forced it steady. "There was a patient I could not save. A wealthy man, well-connected. His family blamed me. They said I killed him with arrogance. They threatened to ruin me, drive me from every practice, every city. I had no choice but to flee." Ruth shifted, chewing her lip now instead of smirking. John leaned back in his chair, slow, deliberate. The lamplight carved the planes of his face into shadow. "You've been hiding this," he said finally, his voice flat, "since the day you stepped off that train." "Yes," she whispered, "because I knew if I told you, if I told any of you, I would never have been given the chance to stay." Silence spread in the little kitchen, heavy as the fever settling on the town outside. Ruth's eyes darted between them, the sharp triumph on her face dimming into something tighter, thinner. For once, she said nothing. John's gaze stayed locked on Victoria, steady, searching, unreadable. John pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against the floor. The sound was sharp, jarring in the hush. He rose without a word, his hand brushing the brim of his hat as if he'd forgotten it wasn't there. "John," Victoria started, reaching toward him. But he shook his head, eyes still shadowed. "I need air." He crossed the room in 3 long strides. The door opened, spilling a strip of moonlight across the floor, then closed behind him with a dull thud. Silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the ticking clock on the mantel. Ruth stepped forward from the doorway, her nightdress brushing the floor. Her eyes glittered, fierce and unsettled. "I was right," she said, her voice tight, almost breathless. "I knew you weren't what you pretended." Victoria turned toward her, weary. "You wanted the truth, Ruth. Now you have it." The girl's chin lifted, her pride sharp as ever. "You're clever, smarter than any of them out there, smarter than him, even." She jerked her head toward the door where John had gone. "But you've ruined it now. They'll never forgive you for lying. Not him, not the town." Victoria's throat ached. "Do you think I don't know that?" Ruth's voice softened, though her words cut. "You should have kept quiet. Let them die, maybe, but kept your place. You've gone and shown them what you are, and once they see it, they won't unsee it." Victoria's hands clenched on the table edge, the wood biting into her palms. She forced herself to meet Ruth's sharp gaze. "Then I'll face them," she said, low but certain. "If they turn me out, so be it. But I will not stand by while children choke for lack of care." Ruth's mouth twisted, as though torn between scorn and admiration. She lingered a moment longer, her eyes searching Victoria's face, then spun and stalked back to her room. The door closed with a sharp click. Victoria stood alone in the kitchen, the lantern flame wavering. Outside, the night was still, but somewhere far off, a cough carried through the darkness. Sunday morning, the church bell tolled slow and solemn, the pews filled with pale faces, voices hushed, glances sharp. Shutters on Main Street stayed closed, but the town gathered here all the same, seeking answers, seeking someone to blame. Victoria walked beside John, Ruth trailing behind. The air inside was close, heavy with the scent of lamp oil and fear. Reverend Henry stood at the pulpit, his Bible open, though his gaze was not fixed on Scripture. It was fixed on her. He raised a hand for silence. Brothers, sisters, you have heard whispers, you have seen with your own eyes. But whispers breed fear, and fear breeds sin. Let the truth be spoken plainly. His eyes rested on Victoria again, steady but not unkind. Mrs. Mercer, would you stand? The pews creaked as heads turned. 100 eyes pressed on her like a weight. John's jaw tightened, his hand brushing hers briefly, but he said nothing. Victoria rose slowly. Her knees felt unsteady, but her voice, when it came, was clear. What you have heard is true. I am. She hesitated, the word catching, then forced it out. A doctor. The silence shattered. Gasps, mutters, the scrape of boots on the floorboards. A woman clutched her child tighter. An old man spat into the aisle. Reverend Henry lifted a hand for calm, but the tide swelled. She admits it, a voice barked. A woman doctor? Another sneered. Blasphemy. She's the reason sickness runs through us now, Anne called, rising from her pew with fire in her eyes. Bringing strange practices into God's house. Yet not all were against her. From the back, a mother called out, She saved my boy when no one else dared touch him. Another voice echoed, trembling. She kept my husband breathing through the night. The church split like a log under an axe, half shouting in anger, half pleading for mercy, for help. Victoria stood in the center of it, hands clasped before her, the truth blazing at last in the open. The noise inside the church swelled until the wooden rafters seemed to tremble with it. Victoria stood rooted, her hands clenched tight before her, as voices clashed and broke like waves. Then Ezekiel Turner rose. He stood tall in his pew, his face ruddy, his voice booming with practiced certainty. There you have it, he thundered. The woman confesses herself a deceiver, lied her way into our town, into a man's home, into this very congregation. Is this what we'll permit? That a woman play at being doctor while men and children sicken? Several heads nodded. Murmurs of agreement rippled outward. Ezekiel pointed a hard finger toward her. She is the cause of this plague. Mark me well. Cast her out before she brings ruin on us all. The cry was taken up by a few at once. Aye, out with her. Send her packing. Boots stamped against the floor, but others shouted back, desperate. And who'll tend the sick then? The doctor's away, Miles gone. She saved little Samuel. She's cursed. She's gifted. The church cracked down its center, voices colliding, filling the air with heat. Wives clutched children closer. Men argued in low, fierce tones, some spitting, some trembling. Ezekiel raised his arms, shouting over the din. Drive her from among us, lest the Lord's wrath burn hotter still. Anne's shrill voice rose in support. He speaks true. But then a thin, quavering voice piped up from the back, old Elizabeth leaning on her cane. She kept me breathing last winter when my lungs near gave out. You'd see me dead in the cold, Ezekiel? That stilled a few, though not enough. The shouting surged again, the church now a battlefield of words. And in the center of it, Victoria stood silent, her shoulders straight, her heart pounding, the tide of judgment crashing around her. The uproar thundered through the church, fists slamming pews, voices cracking in rage and fear. The reverend called for calm, but his words were drowned in the storm. Then John stood. He did not shout. He did not need to. The scrape of his boots and the weight of his silence were enough to draw eyes, one by one, until the noise faltered. His hand rested on the pew before him, his back straight, his voice carrying clear. You'll not drive my wife from this town. Murmurs, shocked and sharp, rippled across the room. She is mine, John went on, his words measured, steady. And I will not see her cast out while our neighbors choke in their beds, not while the graveyard fills. Ezekiel barked from the side. You'd side with a liar against your own people? John's gaze cut to him, hard as a gun barrel. I'll side with the living against the grave, and you should too. The room stilled, caught between fury and shame. Then John turned slowly toward Victoria. His eyes softened, though the weight in them was heavy, grave. He held her gaze, his voice lower now, yet heard by all. But you owe us the truth, Victoria. All of it. No more half words. Can you save them? The question pierced deeper than any accusation. Victoria's lips parted, but no sound came. She saw the faces staring at her, the fearful, the hopeful, the condemning. She saw John's steady gaze, Ruth's burning eyes, the Reverend's furrowed brow. She saw the sickness spreading like fire through the town, and her own hands trembling with knowledge and doubt. She could not promise. She could not lie. Her throat tightened. Her silence was the only answer she had. The lanterns flickered in the hush, and the chapter ended with her face pale but unbowed, caught between doubt and the desperate need of every soul in the room. The morning light spilled pale and cold across Prosperity's main street. For the first time since arriving, Victoria walked it not as John's wife, not as a quiet woman in shawl and bonnet, but as a doctor. A satchel hung at her side, its worn leather creaking with every step. The sight of it drew stares as sharp as the winter wind. Men leaned in their doorframes, watching her pass with hard eyes. Women whispered from behind curtains. Children, pale-faced, peered from windows, coughing into their hands. Ruth trailed half a step behind, her arms folded tight, as if bracing herself against the gazes that burned holes through them both. At the first house, Victoria lifted her hand and knocked. The door opened to a harried woman, her cheeks hollowed with worry. For a breath, her eyes narrowed. Then she caught sight of the satchel, and her expression cracked into desperate relief. "Please," she whispered, voice raw. "It's Samuel. He can't breathe." Victoria nodded once, slipping inside without another word. The boy lay on a cot in the corner, his chest rising and falling with shallow, rasping gasps, his lips tinged blue. The room smelled of sweat and sickness. Victoria dropped to her knees, fingers steady as she opened the satchel. She checked his pulse, his throat, listened to the rattling in his lungs. The boy's mother hovered, wringing her hands, whispering prayers. "Boil water," Victoria said firmly, already preparing a poultice. "Keep the room warm, but crack the window for air. He needs to breathe, not suffocate on fever." The woman darted to obey, relief washing over her face at the sound of command, of certainty. Victoria worked quickly, her hands deft, her voice low and sure. She coaxed a little broth into the boy's mouth, wiped his brow, eased his breathing with herbs she'd ground fine in the satchel. When at last the boy's breath deepened, his chest rising with more strength than before, his mother fell to her knees beside the cot, clutching Victoria's hands. "God bless you," she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "God bless you." Outside, a few neighbors had gathered, drawn by whispers that the doctor woman had come. They craned their necks to see, some with hope, others with suspicion hardening their jaws. Ruth stood at the threshold, her eyes bright, though her lips pressed thin. She looked back at Victoria, her voice low but sharp. "You walk this road wide open," she murmured. "They'll never forget it." Victoria met her gaze, unflinching. "Good. Let them remember." The mercantile was crowded that afternoon, the townsfolk restless, their voices hushed but sharp as knives. Barrels of flour and crates of dried beans stood untouched as Anne stood near the counter, her bonnet tilted just so, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of a tale. "I saw her," Anne whispered, loud enough to carry to half the room. Bent over little Samuel, muttering in some strange tongue while she pressed leaves and powders to his skin. He gasped like he was possessed, then stilled, just like that. Gasps circled, wide eyes darting toward her. "She's no healer," Anne went on, savoring each word. "She's conjuring. You think fever leaves at the touch of a woman's hand? No. It's unholy. It's against God." Old Mrs. Carver clutched her shawl tighter. "But the boy's breathing, isn't he?" Anne's mouth twisted. "For now. But at what cost? Evil works quickly. Mark me, this plague worsens because we let her lay hands on us." From the far end of the counter, Ezekiel's voice boomed, carrying like a bell through the store. "She hides behind books and powders, things no woman ought to touch. And now the Lord tests us, sends sickness to see if we will cast her out or cling to her false cures." Heads nodded, some eager, some uneasy. A man spat into the sawdust at his feet. "She's cursed us already," Ezekiel pressed, his fist thudding the counter. Look around, more fall ill each day. Do you call that healing? The mercantile filled with the sound of whispers, suspicion weaving through the air like smoke. Women traded glances over bolts of cloth, men muttered as they weighed nails and kerosene. By the time the crowd thinned, the story had grown teeth. Victoria spoke strange words, used charms, dabbled in things not fit for Christian hands, and out in the street, as Victoria passed with her satchel, the thanks of that morning curdled into silence. Doors shut quickly, faces turned away. A mother drew her child closer, muttering. Ruth walked beside her, stiff-backed, hearing it all. She flicked a glance at Victoria. "They're calling you witch now," she said quietly. "You think you can stand against that?" Victoria didn't slow. Her voice was calm, though her eyes burned. "I've stood against worse." But in her gut, the weight of the whispers pressed heavier than Ruth could know. The knock came late, after the lamps were lit and the house had settled into uneasy quiet. John rose from his chair, but when he opened the door, it was Reverend Henry standing in the cold, his Bible tucked under one arm, his face weary. "Evening, John," he said softly. "Might I have a word with your wife?" John's eyes flicked to Victoria, who stood in the kitchen rinsing her hands in a basin clouded with herbs. After a long pause, he stepped aside. Henry entered, removing his hat. The lamplight caught the furrows on his brow, lines carved deep from years of worry and prayer. He set his Bible down on the table, as though it weighed more than scripture alone. "Mrs. Mercer," he began, his voice gentle, "you know the town is divided." Victoria dried her hands slowly, watching him. "I've seen it, felt it." Henry nodded, folding his hands. "There are those who would sooner call you witch than healer. Others praise you as the Lord's instrument. But the truth is, the voices rise louder each day, and I fear the sound of them will split this town apart." Ruth hovered in the doorway, listening, her eyes sharp in the shadows. Victoria stepped closer, her jaw set. "And what would you have me do, Reverend? Fold my hands while children die?" Henry's expression tightened, but his voice stayed even. "I would have you tread carefully, show humility, not stand as if above us, but alongside. They will not accept a woman who acts as though she knows more than every man in the room." Her laugh was sharp, bitter. "Humility won't cure fever. Reverence won't draw breath back into a child's lungs. If I bow my head and keep silent, how many more will die before your prayers are answered?" The words struck him. His lips parted, but no answer came. At last he sighed, rubbing his brow. "You speak truth, though it grieves me," he admitted. "Still, know this, Mrs. Mercer, faith holds this town together. If you strain it too far, it may snap, and once broken, it cannot be mended." He replaced his hat, his Bible tucked once more under his arm. With a weary nod, he left them to the silence of the room. Ruth let out a breath she'd been holding. "He's right, you know," she said softly. "They'll never take you as you are." Victoria stood tall, her hands tightening on the edge of the table. "Then they'll take me as they must. I won't bury another child for the sake of their comfort." The morning sun had barely cleared the rooftops when Victoria stepped out with her satchel. The air smelled of smoke from too many sick beds, too many fires left to burn through the night. Ruth followed close, her shawl wrapped tight, wary eyes darting toward every door. They hadn't gone 10 paces down Main Street before Ezekiel Turner strode into their path. He planted himself square in the road, broad shoulders blocking the way, his face hard as stone. "Where do you think you're going, Mrs. Mercer?" he demanded, loud enough for the nearby shops to hear. Victoria stopped, her grip tightening on the satchel strap. "To a patient." Ezekiel's voice boomed, carrying. "And spread your poison further? No, you'll stop here. We don't want your kind meddling with God's work." A crowd began to gather, shopkeepers, housewives, even children peeking from behind their mothers' skirts. Whispers rose, some fearful, some eager for spectacle. Victoria met Ezekiel's glare, her chin lifting. "If it's poison to keep a child breathing, then I'll gladly carry it." The words rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in water. Ezekiel's face reddened. "Blasphemy," he spat. "You shame this town. You shame your husband." The door of the smithy banged open. John strode out, his apron still dusted with soot, his hammer hanging heavy in his hand. His eyes locked on Ezekiel. "You'll not speak of my wife that way." Ezekiel sneered. "Then you stand with her lies? With her unnatural ways?" John stepped forward until the space between them was a breath. He spoke low, but every soul on the street heard it clear. I stand with the woman who's kept our neighbors alive while you wag your tongue. A murmur swept the crowd. Some nodded, relief and hope flickering in their eyes. Others crossed their arms, their faces hardening with suspicion. Anne's voice cut sharp from the edge of the crowd. He's bewitched you, John Mercer. Can't you see it? John turned his head slowly, his gaze cold. The only witchcraft I see is fear twisting your tongues. The street fell into a tense hush, broken only by the distant cough of the sick. Neighbors eyed one another, suspicion on one side, gratitude on the other. The line was drawn, invisible but deep. Those who would cross Victoria's threshold, and those who would bar her from theirs. Ruth's hand tightened on Victoria's sleeve. You've split the town clean in two, she whispered. Victoria stood tall in the silence, her heart pounding. Then let the sick choose which half will save them. The call came at dusk, frantic pounding on the Mercer door. Nathan Caldwell, a wealthy rancher with more cattle than any man in 3 counties, stood on the stoop, his face gray with fear. It's my girl, he choked, his hands twisting his hat. She's burning with fever. Please, come. Without hesitation, Victoria seized her satchel. John caught her eye, his nod steady, and together they followed Nathan through the falling dark to the Caldwell homestead. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with the sour smell of sickness. The girl lay motionless on her bed, her hair damp against her flushed face, breath shallow as a whisper. Her mother hovered at the bedside, wringing her apron, her eyes swollen from crying. Victoria moved swiftly, her voice calm and sure. She ordered cloths for cooling, water for boiling, broth for strength. She mixed powders, ground herbs, checked the girl's pulse, coaxed fluid into her mouth. Her hands never faltered. Hours passed, the family clinging to every motion she made. At last, just as the moonlight spilled pale across the quilt, the girl stirred. Her breathing deepened, steadier, stronger. A sigh of relief rippled through the room. She'll live, Victoria said, exhaustion softening her voice. But she'll need tending. Keep her warm, keep her nourished. She's past the worst. Nathan dropped to his knees before her, his great hands gripping hers. You've saved her. You've saved us. His voice cracked, thick with gratitude. Word spread faster than wildfire. Nathan Caldwell's daughter had been at death's door, and the Mercer woman had dragged her back. Gratitude swelled in some hearts, awe in others. Yet for many suspicion hardened further. If she could save so surely, was it truly medicine or something darker? That night, as Victoria stepped out onto the porch, the air cool against her face, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. Ezekiel. He stood at the edge of the lamplight, his arms folded, his eyes burning. You think you've won them with this show, he said, his voice low, dangerous. But you've not saved this town. You've split it, divided it clean down the middle. He leaned closer, his words like a growl. And divisions burn, Mrs. Mercer. They burn towns to ash. Without waiting for her reply, he turned and strode into the dark, his boots crunching the gravel. Victoria lingered, staring after him. Then she lifted her eyes to the Caldwell windows, where lamplight glowed warm against the shutters. Further down the street, other windows stayed dark, curtains drawn tight against her. Her reflection flickered faint in the glass. Healer, divider, both truths staring back at her. The church bell tolled not for worship, but for warning. Its slow clang carried over prosperity, telling all who heard that another house had fallen ill. By noon, it tolled twice more. Victoria hurried down the street, her satchel bouncing at her hip. Her eyes stung with lack of sleep, her skirts were flecked with soot from too many sickroom fires, yet her pace never faltered. Ruth kept at her side, breathless but determined, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. That's 3 homes since dawn, she muttered. At this rate, there won't be enough left standing to bury the rest. Victoria shot her a sharp glance, but Ruth's eyes held no malice now, only grim truth. At the Garrison home, a boy lay pale and glassy-eyed, his pulse weak beneath Victoria's fingers. She pressed broth to his lips, coaxing him to swallow, then ordered his sister to fetch clean water, his father to haul the soiled bedding out to burn. She moved with quiet authority, never stopping, never pausing to rest. When she rose, Ruth was already there with a cloth, wiping Victoria's hands. You'll wear yourself to bone, she said. Not yet, Victoria replied, her voice hoarse. Not while they're still breathing. By afternoon, they were at the Whitaker house. 2 children lay coughing in the same bed. their mother near collapse. Victoria mixed herbs by candlelight, the room thick with fever's stench. When her hands shook, Ruth steadied the bowl without a word. "You've a knack for this," Victoria murmured, surprised at herself for saying it. Ruth gave a small, tight smile. "I watch, I listen, same as I always have." Night fell before they stumbled out of the Whitakers, lantern light flickering over their exhausted faces. Across the street, neighbors stood silent, watching as Victoria passed, some with gratitude, others with suspicion sharp in their eyes. The bell tolled again. Another house struck. Victoria drew a breath, square and steady despite the ache in her limbs. "Come, Ruth, we're not done." Ruth hesitated, then fell in step beside her. For the first time, the girl's voice held no edge, no mockery, only resolve. "Then neither am I." The lamp in the Carter house guttered low, its flame casting long shadows against the walls. Victoria sat at the bedside of Thomas Carter, his skin damp and gray, his breath rattling shallow in his chest. She pressed a cloth to his brow, whispered instructions to his wife, but in her gut she knew. The fever had burned too long, the man's body too far gone. Hours passed, each breath a struggle, until finally his chest stilled. His wife's wail tore through the room, sharp enough to carry into the street. Victoria bowed her head, her hands clenched tight, the bitter taste of failure rising in her throat. By dawn, the whispers had already taken shape. In the mercantile, Anne's voice carried like poison. She went into the Carter house, and Thomas came out feet first. "Don't you see? She chooses who lives and who dies." Ezekiel stood nearby, nodding gravely, his voice low but strong. "Mark it well. She brings death as often as she brings life. That sickness didn't come from the land, it came with her." The words spread like wildfire. At the well, women muttered that she'd cursed the town. In the smithy, men swore their children would not be touched by her hand. That afternoon, when Victoria approached the Miller home, her satchel in hand, the door remained shut. A voice called through the wood, shaking with fear. "Go away. We'll not have your kind here." Victoria stood silent in the dust, Ruth at her side. From inside came the sound of a child coughing, deep and ragged. Her knuckles whitened on the strap of her satchel, but she turned away, the sting of rejection cutting deeper than exhaustion. Behind her, Ruth muttered, "They'd rather bury their children than let you near." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Then they'll bury them." Her voice was low, almost a growl. "And when they do, they'll know whose words dug the grave." The sun beat down harsh on Main Street, though the air felt heavy, as if sickness itself thickened the sky. Victoria and Ruth walked ahead, their steps quick, heads lowered against the stairs. John followed, carrying supplies from the smithy. It began with a word, sharp, spat from a man leaning against the saloon wall. "Witch." John stiffened, his grip tightening on the crate in his arms. Another voice joined in. "Murderess, Carter's blood is on her hands." Victoria kept walking, shoulders taut. But when a third man, Ezekiel's cousin, stepped into John's path and sneered, "Better chain your woman before she damns us all." John dropped the crate with a thud. The fight was sudden, brutal. John's fist cracked against the man's jaw, sending him sprawling into the dust. Shouts erupted. Two others lunged, fists flying, and John met them blow for blow. The crowd roared as boots scraped, knuckles split, and blood spattered across the street. "John." Victoria's voice cut through, raw with fear. But he didn't stop until the last man staggered back, clutching his face. Breathing hard, John stood in the center of the street, his shirt torn, his knuckles raw and bleeding. He glared at the circle of townsfolk, his voice hoarse but steady. "She saved more lives than your prayers have," he spat. "You want to lay blame, lay it at the sickness, not at her feet." The crowd muttered, some backing away, others hardening their faces. Ezekiel, watching from the steps of the mercantile, smiled thinly but said nothing. That night the house was quiet. Victoria bathed John's bruised hands, her touch gentle, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He winced but didn't pull away. When she finished rapping his knuckles, he caught her wrist, his voice low. "Tell me the truth, Victoria." She looked at him startled. "Are you certain you can stop this?" His eyes searched hers, fierce and desperate. "Not hope, not maybes. Can you?" Her mouth opened, but no words came. She saw the weight of his question, the burden he bore for her, the town, himself. And she knew she could not promise what no one could. The silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. At last, John let her wrist fall, his jaw tight. He leaned back in his chair, eyes shadowed. The only sound was the creak of the house around them, and the faint coughs drifting through the night beyond their walls. The night was close and heavy, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke. Victoria sat by the window, her hands still stained from grinding herbs, her ears sharp to every creak outside. Then it came, the sound of boots, many boots. Lantern light bobbed in the darkness, flickering against the walls of the Mercer house. Voices carried, hard and angry. John was on his feet in an instant, shotgun in hand. Ruth froze in the doorway, her face pale. The men gathered outside the gate, a dozen at least. Their faces lit from below by their own lanterns, eyes sharp with fear turned to fury. At their front stood Ezekiel, Bible in hand, though his voice carried more judgment than scripture. "Victoria Mercer," he bellowed, "you've brought plague upon us, and will not suffer it longer. Pack your things and leave this town before more graves are dug." A rumble of agreement followed, fists shaken, voices rising. John stepped onto the porch, shotgun across his arms, his voice low but carrying. "You'll not touch her." For a moment it seemed the air itself might ignite, fear and the night was close and heavy, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke. Victoria sat by the window, her hands still stained from grinding herbs, her ears sharp to every creak outside. Then it came, the sound of boots, many boots. Lantern light bobbed in the darkness, flickering against the walls of the Mercer house. Voices carried, hard and angry. John was on his feet in an instant, shotgun in hand. Ruth froze in the doorway, her face pale. The men gathered outside the gate, a dozen at least. Their faces lit from below by their own lanterns, eyes sharp with fear turned to fury. At their front stood Ezekiel, Bible in hand, though his voice carried more judgment than scripture. "Victoria Mercer," he bellowed, "you've brought plague upon us, and will not suffer it longer. Pack your things and leave this town before more graves are dug." A rumble of agreement followed, fists shaken, voices rising. John stepped onto the porch, shotgun across his arms, his voice low but carrying. "You'll not touch her." For a moment it seemed the air itself might ignite, fear and fury sparking into violence. Then another voice cut through. "Enough." Reverend Henry strode from the shadows, his lantern held high. His cassock flared in the night wind, his face pale but resolute. "Is this God's justice you serve?" he demanded, his voice ringing against the clapboard walls. "To drive out the only one among us with knowledge to fight this sickness, or is it vengeance you seek, because fear has blinded your hearts?" The mob shifted, uneasy, their mutters softening under the weight of his words. Ezekiel's jaw tightened, but he did not shout again. "You may rail at her," the Reverend continued, his gaze sweeping them, "but you'll not lay a hand on her. Not while I draw breath." The silence that followed was taut as a pulled rope. At last, one by one, the men lowered their fists, their lanterns. With muttered curses they turned back into the dark, boots scuffing the dirt. Ezekiel lingered, his eyes locked on Victoria's window, before he too melted into the night. Inside, John set the shotgun against the wall, his shoulders taut. Ruth clutched the back of a chair, her knuckles white. Victoria stood very still, her face lit by the dying lamplight. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, iron beneath exhaustion. "If they drive me out, they drive out their only chance, so let them rage." She looked from John to Ruth, her eyes fierce. "I'll treat the sick, whether they ask me or not." It came with frantic pounding at the door, louder than the mob's had been. John snatched up the lamp, Victoria her satchel, before the bolt was even drawn back. On the porch stood Anne, wild-eyed, her hands shaking. "It's..." Her voice cracked, the words tumbling out. "It's Ezekiel's wife. She's burning up. He sent me. He's begging you to come." Behind her, Ruth's mouth fell open. The name hung in the air like a curse. Ezekiel, who had sworn Victoria was the town's undoing, now driven to plead for her hands on his own household. There was no hesitation. Victoria seized her coat, her satchel heavy with bottles and cloths, and strode into the night. The Ezekiel home was already crowded when they arrived. Neighbors pressed at the doorway, whispering, watching. Inside, lanterns burned low around the bed. Ezekiel's wife lay thrashing, her skin crimson, lips cracked, eyes rolling. Ezekiel knelt beside her, his proud face broken into fear, his hands trembling as he clutched her arm. When Victoria entered, a ripple passed through the room. Ezekiel rose, his eyes red, his voice raw. Save her. The word was not command, not accusation, but a plea. Victoria set her satchel on the table, her hands moving fast, mixing tinctures, wringing cloths, checking pulse and breath. The room filled with the sharp scent of camphor and vinegar. Sweat beaded her brow, but she didn't falter. Behind her, John kept watch at the doorway, holding the crowd at bay. Ruth hovered close, passing cloths, measuring doses, her young face pale with concentration. Outside, the murmur of voices grew. Half the town gathered in the street waiting, whispering, weighing their judgment. Every soul seemed to hold its breath with each of Ezekiel's wife's gasps. Victoria pressed a cool cloth to the woman's lips, coaxing small sips of the bitter draught. She held her shoulders steady through the fevered thrashing, her own arms aching with strain. She whispered calm, steady words, though her own throat burned with fatigue. And still the fever raged. Minutes stretched into hours, the night deepening, the house thick with the smell of sweat and sickness. At last, as dawn's first light touched the curtains, the woman's breathing eased, the fever broke, her body stilled, sinking into exhausted sleep. Victoria sagged back, her skirts damp with sweat, her chest heaving. Ezekiel stared at his wife, then at Victoria. For a moment his lips moved, but no words came. His hands clenched at his sides, torn between pride and gratitude, between hatred and the truth of what he had just witnessed. Outside, the hush grew heavier. The whole town waited. Victoria stayed kneeling at the bedside, her hand resting lightly on the patient's arm, her eyes fixed, unblinking, on the woman she had pulled back from the edge. The morning broke pale and cold, yet different than the days before. Instead of the toll of the bell, there came whispers along the street. Ezekiel's wife was alive. Alive and sleeping. Victoria stepped out of the Mercer house, her satchel already in hand, and found neighbors lingering by their fences, watching her not with open scorn but with something sharper, more unsettled. Doubt, perhaps, or wonder. At the Caldwell Ranch, the girl she'd saved only days ago sat up in bed, sipping broth with a faint smile. At the Whitakers, the children's fever had ebbed, leaving them weak but breathing steady. Each door she left behind carried a little less wailing, a little more silence of relief. Still, the streets were hushed, as though the town was holding its breath, waiting to see whether this turn was fortune or trick. By noon, Victoria's hands shook from fatigue. She sat at the table, grinding herbs with stiff wrists, when Ruth pushed the pestle aside. "You'll fall before the sickness does," Ruth said, her tone sharp but her eyes steady. Victoria rubbed her brow, smudges of ash beneath her eyes. "If I stop now, the fever takes back what I've won." "You've bought us time," Ruth countered, "but time won't matter if you collapse." The words stung because they were true, but Victoria only set her jaw and reached for the next vial. Outside, the town was stirring, rumors spreading, people daring to hope. That hope was fragile as spun glass, and she knew, if it shattered now, it might never come again. The Ezekiel home smelled of boiled linens and camphor, the sour edge of fever slowly lifting. His wife lay beneath a patched quilt, her cheeks no longer crimson, her breath steady and deep. A damp cloth rested on her brow, fresh from Victoria's hand. Ezekiel sat at her bedside, hunched forward, staring. For days he had prayed, railed, demanded, begged, and she had answered. Not God, not his own strength, but the woman he had sworn was a curse. His wife stirred faintly, lips parting. "Cool," she whispered, her voice cracked but clear. "So cool now." He caught her hand, swallowed hard, tears pricking hot at the corners of his eyes. Relief swelled in his chest, but so too did something darker, a knot of shame, fury, pride too deep to yield. To thank Victoria meant to confess every word he had shouted was hollow. To admit he had been wrong meant to surrender the sway he held over the town. Behind him, the floor creaked. Anne stepped in softly, a bundle of fresh cloths in her arms. Her eyes went from the wife's sleeping face to Ezekiel's clenched jaw. "You see," she said low, "the town will turn. They'll follow her, not you." Ezekiel didn't answer. His wife's breathing filled the silence, steady, undeniable. Anne set the cloths down, her voice sharpening. "If you yield now, you'll lose them all. And once they're hers, you'll never have them back." Ezekiel rose slowly, his fists curling. He looked at his wife, then at the door through which Victoria had left, the air still faint with her herbs. When he spoke, his voice was ragged with something close to desperation. "Then we'll end this tomorrow. before she roots herself so deep the town forgets who she really is. By late afternoon, the bell was rung again, not for sickness but for summoning. Word spread quick as prairie fire. Ezekiel had called the town together. The square filled as the sun sank low, lanterns lit against the coming dark. Families stood shoulder to shoulder, whispers curling through the crowd like smoke. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, the air thick with unease. Ezekiel stood on the steps of the mercantile, his black coat sharp against the fading sky. His Bible rested in his hand, but his voice thundered more like a judge than a shepherd. This town was once spared plague and curse, he declared, his words carrying across the square. But since the arrival of Victoria Mercer, death has walked our streets. Some say she saves, but I tell you, her touch is a snare. She brought this sickness from the east, and it festers wherever she treads. A rumble of agreement swept the crowd. Anne's eyes gleamed as she nodded, her voice sharp. She plays healer, but mark it, witches have their craft too. Before the tide could swell further, Reverend Henry stepped forward. His lantern light caught the silver at his temples, his face lined with weariness but firm. Ezekiel speaks of judgment, he said, his voice steady, but I have seen God's mercy in her work. Lives have been saved, more than lost. Would you cast out the one whose hands have spared your children, your kin? The crowd stirred, divided, torn between faith and fear. Then John's voice cut through, rough and burning. You'd all be burying your families if not for her. He strode to Victoria's side, his fist still scarred from the last fight. I've watched her bleed herself dry for this town. You'd call her curse? She's the only reason we're still standing. A hush fell. All eyes turned as Ruth, usually silent in such matters, stepped forward. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders, her young face pale but resolute. I've worked beside her, she said, her voice clear. I've seen what she does. There's no witchcraft in her hands, only knowledge, and courage none of you dared show. Without her, I'd be dead, and so would half the town. The square went quiet, the air thick with shifting hearts. Ezekiel's jaw clenched, his fingers digging into the spine of his Bible. The silence held, brittle as glass, as if the next breath might shatter it into riot. The air cracked with voices sharp as breaking glass. She's a curse, one man shouted. She saved my sister, another bellowed back. She brought this on us. She's the only reason we've hope. The square writhed with fury and fear, bodies pressing, fists shaking, mothers clutching children tighter. The Reverend called for order, but his words were drowned in the din. Ezekiel thundered scripture. John roared back defiance. Anne hissed venom to any ear that bent near. Victoria stood still in the chaos, her satchel heavy in her grip, her eyes sweeping the crowd. Every face glared with desperation, half pleading, half condemning. Then it happened. A thin cry cut through the shouting. A boy, no more than 6, staggered at the edge of the crowd. His mother's hand slipped from his as he crumpled, coughing, gasping, his small body convulsing in the dust. The square froze. Shouts died in throats. Even Ezekiel faltered, his mouth half open. The child lay twitching, his breath shallow, eyes glassy with fever. His mother dropped to her knees, read screaming his name, clawing at his shoulders. Silence fell heavy as stone. Dozens of eyes turned, one by one, to Victoria. She tightened her hold on the satchel, the pulse in her throat hammering. This was no debate now. No rumor, no sermon, no argument. Only life and death, kneeling at her feet. Victoria was already moving, skirts gathering dust as she dropped to her knees beside the boy. His small chest heaved in shallow bursts, his lips blue at the edges. "Clear a space," she barked, her voice sharp enough to cut the silence. The crowd shuffled back, hesitant, wide-eyed. She opened her satchel, hands steady despite the tremor of exhaustion. Cloth, tincture, vial, each motion practiced sure. She propped the boy's head, coaxed a few drops of the bitter draught past his clenched teeth. His mother sobbed, clutching the hem of Victoria's skirt, whispering prayers through her tears. "Breathe, little one," Victoria murmured, her palm firm against his chest, her voice low and fierce. "You'll not go under tonight." Minutes stretched long, the square holding its breath. Then the boy coughed. A ragged, hacking sound, but his chest lifted fuller, his lips flushing faintly with color. Another breath followed, steadier. His mother cried out, half scream, half laugh, gathering him in trembling arms. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors stared at Victoria as though seeing her for the first time, not shadowed, not whispered about, but plain in the lantern light. A woman with blood on her hands, not from curse, but from saving. John stepped closer, standing at her side, pride blazing in his eyes. Ruth pressed forward too, her shawl slipping, her voice steady as she said, "You saw it, all of you, with your own eyes." Reverend Henry bowed his head, murmuring a prayer of thanks. Ezekiel stood rigid on the mercantile steps, his Bible limp in his hand, his face twisted, torn between fury and the undeniable truth before him. Words rose to his lips, but none came. The crowd was no longer with him. Dozens of eyes turned instead to Victoria, not with scorn, not with fear, but with something heavier, humbler. Recognition. Doctor. Victoria rose slowly, her skirts dust-stained, her brow damp, her eyes burning with exhaustion and unyielding will. She met their gaze in silence, the square alive with the weight of her victory. The town of Prosperity woke changed, not in an instant, not in a grand proclamation, but in the small, stubborn ways that life insists on carrying forward. The bell rang less and less, first once a day, then not at all. Doors that had been bolted shut cracked open. Children stepped blinking into the sunlight, laughter slowly returning where sobs had lived. Graves still marked the edge of town, fresh earth mounded in rows, but no new ones joined them. Victoria moved among the people openly now, her satchel swinging at her side. Some still glanced away, old suspicion clinging like burrs, but most met her eyes. Some even nodded, a wordless thanks. She had become part of the town's daily rhythm, as necessary as the blacksmith's hammer or the preacher's bell. At the Caldwell Ranch, the girl she'd saved chased chickens across the yard. At the Garrison home, the boy who had once lain glassy-eyed ran to meet her with a grin, clutching a stick like a sword. Ruth walked at her side more often than not, carrying a bundle of cloths, her chin held higher than before. She'd taken to calling herself Victoria's assistant, half in jest, half in earnest, her sharp tongue now aimed at slackers rather than at Victoria. John was quieter, though his pride in her never dimmed. He worked his land by day, stood at her side by night, his presence a steady shield that words could never fully capture. Ezekiel kept his pulpit, but his fire had dimmed. His wife lived, and that fact alone blunted his sermons. He still watched Victoria with hard eyes, but when his words turned sharp, fewer ears bent to them. Anne, once his loudest ally, now stood apart, her whispers falling into silence. On one clear morning, months after the worst had passed, the townsfolk gathered in the square again. Not to judge, not to condemn, but to build a new clinic, rough boards and beams hammered into place by willing hands. John raised the frame, Ruth fetched nails, even the Reverend carried wood. Victoria stood at the threshold, her satchel slung over her shoulder, the smell of fresh pine and earth in the air. For the first time since her arrival, no whispers followed her. Just one voice, the blacksmith's wife, soft but certain as she set down a basket of bread. "Dr. Mercer," she said, "this is yours." Victoria's throat tightened, her eyes burning as she looked at the frame rising in the sunlight. She had come to Prosperity as a bride, hiding her truth. She stayed as something else, unmasked, unshaken, and unforgotten. The town had its doctor. And at last, Victoria had her place.